Rain hammered St. Bartholomew Cathedral the morning Sarah Whitmore's perfect wedding turned into a public execution. Nathaniel Carlyle, Boston's golden political heir, stood at the altar and announced to a room full of cameras that he couldn't marry a woman beneath his family's name. 200 guests gasped as Sarah's humiliation went viral in real time. She fled down cathedral steps into freezing November air and collided with a stranger beside a black Rolls-Royce. Tall, dangerous, Italian. He offered her a handkerchief for her bleeding palm and a single impossible choice: marry me instead. His name was Lucien de Luca, and Boston whispered it with fear. If you want to see how far revenge can take a broken woman, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The silk wedding gown cost Sarah 3 months' worth of tips from the diner where she'd worked double shifts for 2 years. Hand-sewn ivory fabric, delicate lace sleeves, a train that pooled behind her like spilled milk. She'd saved for it the way other people saved for down payments, one crumpled bill at a time, hidden in a shoebox under her bed in the cramped apartment she shared with 2 other waitresses in Dorchester. Now the dress felt like a straitjacket. Sarah stood at the altar of St. Bartholomew Cathedral with 200 pairs of eyes drilling into her spine. Every pew overflowed with Boston's elite, politicians in custom suits, investors who measured their net worth in offshore accounts, socialites who treated weddings like blood sport. The stained glass windows above her head depicted scenes she didn't recognize anymore. Colors bleeding through November rain that hammered the roof like a drumbeat counting down to disaster. Nathaniel Carlyle stood beside her in a charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. Golden hair perfectly styled, jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He looked like a campaign poster come to life, which was exactly the point, Sarah realized too late. She'd met him 18 months ago when he wandered into the diner at 2 in the morning, charming and exhausted after some fundraiser. He'd asked for coffee and her number. She'd given him both, stupidly believing fairy tales could happen to girls like her. The officiant droned through vows Sarah barely heard over the roaring in her ears. Her hands trembled as she held the bouquet of white roses Nathaniel's mother had picked out. Patricia Carlyle sat in the front row wearing Chanel and a smile so tight it looked painful. Beside her, Senator Richard Carlyle checked his phone every 30 seconds, his expression carved from granite and political calculation. Something felt wrong. Sarah had felt it all morning while stylists fussed over her hair and makeup artists painted her face into someone she didn't recognize. She'd felt it during the car ride to the cathedral when Nathaniel barely looked at her, his attention fixed on his phone, thumbs moving in rapid-fire texts. She felt it now as the officiant asked if anyone objected to this union, and the silence stretched too long, too heavy, too full of something she couldn't name. Nathaniel turned toward her. For one breathless second, Sarah thought he might actually say something real, something true. His blue eyes, the same eyes that had gazed at her across candlelit dinners and promised her forever, met hers with an expression she'd never seen before. Pity. "I can't do this," Nathaniel said. The words dropped into the cathedral like stones into still water. Ripples of confused murmuring spread through the pews. Sarah's fingers went numb around the bouquet stems. "What?" Her voice came out strangled. Nathaniel stepped back from the altar. He looked past her toward the rows of guests, toward the cameras positioned discreetly at the back of the cathedral, because of course there were cameras. The Carlyle family never did anything without documentation, without spin, without thinking 3 moves ahead. "I can't marry a woman beneath my family's name," Nathaniel announced, his voice carrying through the vaulted space with practiced projection. "My father is running for Senate. Our family has a legacy to protect. And Sarah—" He paused, manufactured regret dripping from every syllable. "Sarah is a wonderful person, but she's not one of us." The cathedral erupted. Gasps, whispers, the unmistakable click of phone cameras capturing Sarah's destruction, frame by frame. She stood frozen at the altar in her 3-month salary dress while 200 strangers watched her humiliation become entertainment, become content, become something they'd share at dinner parties for years. Patricia Carlyle rose from her seat, already moving toward her son with a mother's protective fury. But her eyes, when they flicked toward Sarah, weren't apologetic. They were triumphant, satisfied, like she'd orchestrated this exact moment. She had. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. This was planned. Nathaniel's late-night texts, Patricia's tight smile. The cameras positioned just right to catch every angle. They'd never intended to let this wedding happen. She was supposed to be humiliated, discarded, turned into a cautionary tale about girls who reached too far above their station. Senator Carlisle stood, straightening his tie. He placed one hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, proud, approving, and Sarah finally understood what she'd been too naive to see before. She was never a fiancée. She was a prop, a temporary image boost for a political campaign, the hardworking waitress dating the golden heir. Relatable, authentic. Good for polling numbers among working-class voters who needed to believe the American dream still existed. But now that the primary was over and Richard Carlisle's Senate campaign was gaining real momentum, they didn't need her anymore. They needed Nathaniel to look decisive, strong, willing to make tough choices for family and legacy. Breaking her heart on camera made him look like both. "Sarah!" Nathaniel's voice pulled her back to the present horror. He stepped closer, reaching for her hand. "You'll understand someday. This is better for everyone." She jerked away from his touch. "Better?" The word scraped out of her throat. "You humiliated me in front of everyone." "I gave you honesty," Nathaniel said smoothly, already performing for the cameras. "Isn't that more respectful than living a lie?" Laughter bubbled up Sarah's chest, sharp and bitter and completely inappropriate. She wanted to scream, to throw the bouquet at his perfect face, to set the cathedral on fire and dance in the ashes. Instead, she turned and ran. The aisles stretched forever. Faces blurred past, shocked, delighted, pitying. Every step felt like walking through quicksand in shoes that pinched and a dress that tangled around her legs. Someone's phone flashed in her peripheral vision. Someone else laughed. A high, cruel sound that followed her all the way to the massive wooden doors. She shoved them open and stumbled into freezing November air. Rain slammed into her immediately, soaking through the ivory silk in seconds. The cathedral steps were slick beneath her heels. Sarah's vision blurred with tears and rage, and the particular kind of desperation that came from realizing your entire life was built on lies. She needed to get away, needed to disappear, needed to... She collided with something solid. Not something, someone. Strong hands caught her arms, steadying her before she could tumble down the remaining steps. Sarah looked up through rain-soaked lashes at a man who definitely hadn't been at the wedding. She would have remembered him. Tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair slicked back from a face all sharp angles and Mediterranean heritage. He wore a black suit tailored so precisely it might as well have been painted on. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they studied her with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch, despite everything else falling apart. Behind him sat a black Rolls-Royce, engine purring, driver waiting patiently despite the chaos unfolding at the cathedral entrance. "You're bleeding," the man said. His voice carried a subtle Italian accent, each word precise and unhurried. Sarah glanced down. Her palm was bleeding where she'd gripped the rose stems too hard, thorns biting deep. She hadn't even felt it. Didn't feel much of anything except the hollow numbness spreading through her chest. The man produced a handkerchief from his pocket, actual linen, monogrammed with initials she didn't recognize, and wrapped it carefully around her hand. His touch was clinical, but not cold. Efficient, like he'd done this before. "Thank you," Sarah managed. Her voice sounded distant, unfamiliar. "You're trembling." The man's dark eyes swept over her, taking in the ruined dress, the mascara probably streaking down her face, the complete devastation of someone whose life just imploded on camera. "And you're about to be swarmed." He gestured slightly toward the cathedral doors. Sarah turned her head and saw guests beginning to spill out. Phones raised, voices calling her name with false concern that barely masked their excitement. The show wasn't over. They wanted Act 2. The breakdown. The tears. The public unraveling that would give them content for weeks. Panic clawed up Sarah's throat. "I need to leave," she whispered. "Yes," the man agreed. "You do." He opened the Rolls-Royce's rear door with one smooth motion. Sarah stared at the leather interior, at the man with his impossible calm, and his expensive car, and his eyes that saw too much. Every rational instinct screamed that getting into a stranger's vehicle was monumentally stupid, dangerous, the kind of decision horror movies opened with. But staying here, facing cameras and questions and Nathaniel's pitying smile, felt infinitely worse. Sarah climbed into the car. The man slid in beside her, closing the door on the sound of rain and raised voices. The driver pulled away from the curb immediately, smooth and practiced. Through the tinted windows, Sarah watched the cathedral recede, watched her humiliation become smaller, watched the life she'd tried to build disappear into November gloom. She should feel terrified. Instead, she felt numb. "Who are you?" Sarah asked after several blocks of silence. "Lucien de Luca?" The name meant nothing to her. Should it? Lucien studied her with that same unnerving intensity. "You don't know who I am." "Should I?" "Most people in Boston do." He shifted slightly, angling toward her. "But you're not from here originally, are you? You don't move like someone who grew up with money or connections." It wasn't quite an insult, more an observation. Sarah's fingers tightened on the damp handkerchief wrapped around her palm. "I grew up in foster care in Ohio," she said flatly. "Worked my way through community college. Moved to Boston 3 years ago because I was stupid enough to think I could make something of myself here." "You're articulate, intelligent. You carry yourself like someone who survived worse than public humiliation. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to make you angry." Lucian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his voice. "Nathaniel Carlyle used you. His family orchestrated that entire spectacle because they needed a villain for their political narrative, the gold-digging waitress who tried to trap their perfect son. They'll spin it that way within the hour." Sarah's stomach dropped. He was right. Of course he was right. She could already imagine the headlines, the social media posts, the carefully crafted statements from the Carlyle family's PR team. "Why do you care?" she demanded. "Because I understand being used." Lucien pulled out his phone, tapped something, then turned the screen toward her. It was a photo. Nathaniel's father, Senator Richard Carlyle, shaking hands with Lucien in what looked like an office. Both men were smiling, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. "Your ex-fiancé's father borrowed $12 million from me 18 months ago," Lucien said quietly, "to fund his Senate campaign. The loan was supposed to be repaid 6 months ago. It hasn't been. The interest is now substantial." Sarah's brain struggled to process this information through the fog of shock and rage. "You're a loan shark?" "I prefer businessman." Lucian's smile was razor thin. "But the distinction is largely semantic. The point is, the Carlyle family owes me a considerable amount of money. Money they don't have. Money they can't pay back without destroying their political aspirations." "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything." Lucien pocketed his phone. "You were never supposed to become Nathaniel's wife. You were supposed to make him look relatable long enough to get his father through the primary. Then you were supposed to disappear quietly. But if you'd married him, you would have become legally entitled to assets the Carlyles can't afford to share. You would have had questions about their finances, about where money came from, about debts they'd rather keep hidden." Sarah's breath came shorter. "So they humiliated me instead. They neutralized you. Made you look like the villain so no one would listen if you tried to speak up. Made you small, forgettable." Lucien leaned forward slightly. "But here's what the Carlyles don't know. I've been watching you for months." Ice slid down Sarah's spine. "What?" "I investigate people who might become problems. When Richard Carlyle borrowed money he couldn't repay, I started learning everything about his family. His son's relationships." Lucian's dark eyes held hers. "You're not what they said you are. You're not a gold digger. You're not stupid. You're a woman who worked herself to exhaustion trying to earn love from people who never intended to give it." The accuracy of that statement hurt worse than Nathaniel's public rejection. "I don't understand why you're telling me this," Sarah whispered. "Because I'm offering you a choice." Lucian's voice dropped lower, intimate and dangerous. "Walk away. Disappear. Let the Carlyles win. Let them turn you into a punchline while they continue building their empire on borrowed money and destroyed lives. Or marry me instead." Sarah laughed. It came out broken and slightly hysterical. "You're insane. Possibly. Lucien didn't smile. But I'm also serious. Marry me. Let me rebuild you into someone powerful enough to destroy the people who hurt you. Let me give you resources, protection, and revenge. Why would you do that? Because it serves my interests. The Carlyles owe me money. If you marry into my world, you become leverage. You become proof that they don't control their own narrative. You become everything they tried to erase. Lucien paused. And because I've spent months watching you survive people who didn't deserve your loyalty. I'm curious what you'd become if someone actually invested in your potential. The Rolls-Royce slowed. Sarah looked out the window and realized they'd stopped in front of a hotel, the kind with doormen and chandeliers visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind she'd walked past 1,000 times without ever imagining she'd enter. This is your stop, Lucien said. I booked you a suite. Clothes in your size are already there, credit cards in your name, everything you need to disappear for a few days while you decide. He handed her a business card, thick paper, embossed lettering, just a name and a phone number. If you want revenge, Lucien continued quietly, call me within 48 hours. If you want to forget this day ever happened, don't call. Either way, the suite is yours for a week, no strings. Sarah stared at the card, at the man who'd appeared out of nowhere with impossible offers and eyes that saw too much. Every rational thought screamed this was a trap. A different kind of trap than Nathaniel had set, but a trap nonetheless. But she was so tired of being rational, so tired of being careful, so tired of shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. What's the catch? Sarah asked. The catch is that my world is dangerous. The catch is that marrying me means entering an empire built on things polite society pretends don't exist. The catch is that once you're in, there's no going back to being invisible. Lucien held her gaze. But you'll never be humiliated again. You'll never be powerless again. And the people who hurt you will learn exactly what happens when they underestimate the wrong woman. The driver opened Sarah's door. Cold November air rushed in. Sarah looked at the hotel entrance, at the card in her hand, at the man who'd somehow known exactly when to find her and exactly what to offer. She thought about Nathaniel's pitying smile, Patricia's triumphant eyes, 200 guests watching her break, cameras capturing her destruction, the life she'd built dissolving like sugar in rain. She thought about going back to her apartment in Dorchester, back to double shifts at the diner, back to being nobody from nowhere who'd briefly entertained fantasies of belonging. Or she could call the number on the card. Sarah climbed out of the car without looking back. The driver handed her a room key. The Rolls-Royce pulled away into traffic, leaving her standing on the sidewalk in a soaked wedding dress that cost 3 months of tips and dreams she could never get back. Inside the hotel suite, Sarah found everything Lucien had promised. Designer clothes in her exact size. Shoes that actually fit. A bathroom stocked with expensive toiletries. A refrigerator full of food she didn't have to budget for. She peeled off the ruined wedding dress and left it in a wet heap on the marble floor. Then she stood under a shower hot enough to scald, letting the water wash away mascara and pretense and the particular kind of hope that came from believing love could save you. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a robe that cost more than her monthly rent, Sarah found her phone had died. She plugged it in, waited, watched it come back to life. 73 messages, 42 missed calls, 6 voicemails, social media notifications scrolling past too fast to count. Sarah opened Instagram and immediately wished she hadn't. The photos were everywhere. Her fleeing down cathedral steps, her face twisted in anguish, her dress soaked and clinging. Headlines screamed variations of the same narrative. Gold digger exposed. Carlisle heir dodges bullet. Wedding scandal rocks Boston elite. Nathaniel had already posted a statement, dignified, regretful, explaining how difficult it was to end a relationship with someone he cared about, but family and legacy had to come first. The comments beneath praised his courage, his integrity, his commitment to his father's campaign. No one asked about Sarah. No one cared that she'd been destroyed. She was just collateral damage in someone else's story. Sarah dropped the phone on the bed, walked to the window, stared out at Boston's skyline glittering in the rain like a city that had never heard her name and never would. Lucien De Luca's business card sat on the nightstand where she'd left it. She picked it up, studied the embossed lettering. Wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life or the first real choice she'd ever made. The phone rang. Sarah answered without checking the caller ID. "I see you made it safely." Lucian's voice carried through the speaker, smooth and certain. "You're having me followed," Sarah said flatly. "I'm making sure you're protected. There's a difference." "Is there?" "In my world?" "Yes." A pause. "Have you eaten?" Sarah glanced at the refrigerator. She hadn't touched the food, hadn't felt hungry, hadn't felt much of anything except the hollow rage still burning in her chest. "I'm not hungry. You should eat anyway. You're going to need your strength for what comes next. You sound very certain I'm going to call you." "I am." Lucian's confidence wasn't arrogant, just factual. "Because you're not the kind of woman who runs away. You're the kind who burns everything down and builds something better from the ashes. You don't know me. I know you better than Nathaniel Carlisle ever did." Lucian's voice dropped lower. "I know you worked 3 jobs to put yourself through community college. I know you send money to your foster sister in Ohio every month, even though you can barely afford rent. I know you stayed with Nathaniel long after you realized he didn't actually love you because you were terrified of being alone again. I know you're stronger than you've ever allowed yourself to be." Sarah's throat tightened. "Stop. Why? Because I'm telling you things you don't want to hear, or because you're realizing someone finally sees you?" The line went silent, except for the sound of rain against windows. 48 hours, Lucian said quietly. "That's how long the offer stands. After that, I can't protect you from what the Carlyles will do to your reputation. After that, you're on your own." He hung up before Sarah could respond. She stood in the darkening hotel room with the phone pressed to her ear and the business card clutched in her other hand. Outside, Boston continued glittering and indifferent. Inside, something fundamental was shifting in Sarah's chest. Some part of her that had spent years being careful and grateful and small was finally cracking open. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the first true thing she'd felt in months. Sarah looked at herself in the full-length mirror across the room. Hair still damp, face scrubbed clean of the makeup that had tried to turn her into someone else. Body wrapped in a robe that didn't belong to her, standing in a suite she hadn't paid for, holding a choice she didn't fully understand. But for the first time since the cathedral, she didn't see a victim. She saw a woman who'd survived worse than public humiliation, who'd built a life from nothing before and could do it again, who was so goddamn tired of being powerless. Sarah picked up her phone and typed out a text before she could talk herself out of it. "I want them to pay for what they did." The response came within seconds. "Then marry me. I'll make sure they never forget your name." Sarah stared at those words until they blurred, until the hotel room felt too small, until the rage in her chest became something sharper, something useful. She typed one more message. "When?" "Tomorrow night. My estate. I'll send a car. That's not enough time. Time is a luxury you don't have. Every hour you wait is another hour the Carlyles control the narrative. Another hour you stay the villain in their story." A pause. Then, "Unless you'd rather wait, unless you're having second thoughts." Sarah looked at the soaked wedding dress still crumpled on the bathroom floor, at the phone still showing social media posts that turned her humiliation into entertainment, at the empty suite that felt less like sanctuary and more like a holding cell. She thought about Nathaniel's manufactured regret, Patricia's satisfaction, Richard Carlyle's calculating eyes, 200 people who'd witnessed her destruction and felt nothing except relief they weren't the spectacle. "No second thoughts," Sarah typed. "Send the car. Smart girl. Someone will contact you tomorrow with details. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start building your empire." The line went dead. Sarah sat on the edge of the king-size bed in a hotel room that cost more per night than she made in a week and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Not hope. Hope was for people who still believed in happy endings. This was something darker, colder, more permanent. She pulled up her messages and scrolled until she found Nathaniel's contact. He'd texted 3 times since the cathedral. Apologetic. Explanatory. Making sure she understood why he'd done what he had to do. Sarah deleted his number without reading the messages. Then she deleted every photo, every text conversation, every digital trace of a relationship that had only ever been real to her. When she finished, her phone felt lighter. She felt lighter. Outside, rain continued hammering Boston with November fury. Inside, Sarah Whitmore made a choice that would either save her or destroy her completely. She dialed Lucian's number one more time. He answered on the first ring. "Having regrets already?" His voice carried a note of amusement. "No," Sarah said, "but I need to know something before tomorrow." "Ask." "When we destroy them, and I need you to promise we will destroy them, I want to be the one who looks Nathaniel in the eye when it happens. I want him to see exactly what he created, what he turned me into." Silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. Then Lucian laughed, low and genuinely pleased. "You're going to be magnificent," he said. "Yes, Sarah. When we burn the Carlyle Empire to the ground, you'll be standing right beside me. You'll be the last thing Nathaniel Carlyle sees before his entire world collapses." "Good," Sarah whispered. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow, everything changes." He hung up. Sarah lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She should feel terrified, should feel like she'd just made a catastrophic mistake, should feel something other than this cold, burning certainty that she was done being the kind of woman who apologized for taking up space. Somewhere across the city, Nathaniel was probably sleeping soundly, confident he'd made the right choice. Confident Sarah would disappear quietly into the kind of obscurity reserved for people who dared to reach above their station. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did Sarah, really. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from the unknown. She was running straight toward it with her eyes wide open and her hands ready to burn. The car arrived at 9 the next morning. Not the Rolls-Royce from yesterday. This was a black Mercedes S-Class with windows tinted dark enough to be illegal and a driver who didn't bother with small talk. He simply held the door open while Sarah climbed into leather seats that smelled like money and decisions she couldn't take back. She'd barely slept. Spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, alternating between certainty and panic. Around 3 in the morning, she'd pulled up everything she could find about Lucien DeLuca on her phone. The results were sparse, deliberate. A few mentions in business journals about real estate acquisitions. One grainy photo from a charity gala 5 years ago. Nothing that explained who he actually was or what kind of empire he'd built. But the absence of information told its own story. People who controlled their digital footprint that completely weren't running legitimate businesses. They were running something else. Something that required shadows and silence and the kind of power that didn't need to advertise itself. Sarah wore clothes from the hotel suite, tailored black pants, a silk blouse the color of cream, boots with enough heel to make her feel taller than she was. Everything fit perfectly. Lucian had known her measurements down to the centimeter, which should have terrified her more than it did. The Mercedes pulled away from the hotel and headed north out of the city. Sarah watched Boston's skyline shrink in the side mirror, watched the urban sprawl give way to suburbs, then estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates. Old money lived out here. Generational wealth that didn't bother with flashy displays because everyone already knew who mattered. They drove for 40 minutes before turning onto a private road that wound through dense woods still clinging to the last of their autumn leaves. The trees opened suddenly onto a view that made Sarah's breath catch despite everything. Lucien's estate sat on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The main house was 3 stories of pale stone and massive windows, architecture that blended classical proportions with modern glass. Wings extended on either side like arms reaching toward the ocean. Gardens sprawled in geometric precision despite the November cold. Boxwood hedges, stone fountains, pathways that probably looked magical in summer. Beyond the house, waves crashed against rocks 100 feet below, sending up spray that caught the morning light. It was the most beautiful prison Sarah had ever seen. The Mercedes stopped in front of the main entrance. Before the driver could move, the front door opened and Lucien emerged. He wore dark pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. No tie, no jacket. Somehow he looked more dangerous this way, less polished, more real. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it. His eyes found Sarah through the car window with the same intensity she remembered from yesterday. He opened her door himself. "You came," Lucian said. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might reconsider once survival instinct kicked in." He stepped back, giving her space to exit the car. "Most people would have run." Sarah climbed out and looked up at the house. "I'm not most people." "No." Lucien's mouth curved slightly. "You're not." He led her inside without ceremony. The foyer was all marble floors and soaring ceilings, a staircase that curved upward like something from a different century. Art hung on the walls, real art, the kind Sarah only recognized from museum trips. Everything was beautiful. Everything was expensive. Everything screamed power without having to say a word. "This way," Lucien said. She followed him through hallways that felt designed to disorient, past rooms she glimpsed but couldn't quite process. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a sitting room with windows overlooking the ocean that probably cost more than her entire life up to this point. They ended up in what Lucien called his office, a corner room with glass walls on two sides, the Atlantic crashing below, Boston visible as a distant smudge on the southern horizon. The desk was black walnut. The chairs were Italian leather. Technology hummed quietly in built-in panels that looked deceptively simple. A woman stood beside the desk. Late 50s, iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun, wearing a charcoal suit that made her look like she'd stepped out of a courtroom. Her eyes swept over Sarah with the kind of assessment that cataloged everything in 3 seconds flat. "Sarah Whitmore," Lucien said. "This is Elena Marchetti. She handles my legal affairs." Elena extended her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, slightly cold. "Ms. Whitmore," Elena said. Her accent was thicker than Lucien's. As pure Italian with edges that hadn't softened despite what Sarah guessed were decades in America. "I understand you're considering an arrangement with Mr. DeLuca." "That's a polite way to put it," Sarah said. Elena's expression didn't change. "I deal in contracts, not romance. Mr. DeLuca has asked me to prepare documentation for a marriage that serves both your interests. Before we proceed, I need to ensure you understand what you're agreeing to." She gestured to the desk where papers were already spread out in neat stacks. Sarah approached slowly, aware of Lucien watching her from near the windows, giving her space but not leaving, not letting her face this alone. "Sit," Elena said, not unkindly. Sarah sat. Elena took the chair across from her and began laying out documents with practiced efficiency. "This is a prenuptial agreement," Elena explained, tapping the first stack. "It protects Mr. DeLuca's assets in the event of divorce. Standard. However, it also guarantees you certain protections. A trust fund in your name, inaccessible to anyone but you, that activates upon marriage. $5 million initially. An additional $1 million per year you remain married. If you divorce, you keep everything accrued up to that point." Sarah's hands went numb. $5 million? Upon signing, the account is already established. Elena slid a bank statement across the desk. Sarah stared at numbers she'd never imagined seeing attached to her name. "Why?" Sarah looked at Lucien. "Why would you give me that much money?" "Because you need to know you're choosing this freely," Lucien said from the windows. "Not because you're desperate. Not because you have no other options. You can take that money right now, walk out of here, and build whatever life you want. Or you can stay. But if you stay, it's because you want what I'm offering, not because you need to survive." Elena continued as if this were perfectly normal. "The marriage contract specifies certain expectations. You will appear publicly as Mr. DeLuca's wife when required. You will not discuss his business affairs with anyone outside this organization. You will live here, in this estate, for the duration of the marriage. In exchange, you receive financial security, legal protection, and Mr. DeLuca's considerable resources to pursue any personal or professional goals you choose." "What about—" Sarah's voice caught. She forced the words out. "What about the Carlyles?" Elena's eyes sharpened. "That falls under a separate agreement, personal, not legal." She glanced at Lucien. He nodded once. Elena slid another document forward. "Mr. DeLuca intends to collect the debt owed by Senator Richard Carlyle through legal channels that will result in significant financial and political damage to the family. You will be part of that process. Visible. Undeniable. A living reminder that the Carlyles do not control their own narrative." Sarah's pulse hammered in her throat. "How soon?" 3 weeks, Lucien said. "Senator Carlyle is hosting a fundraiser. 500 guests. Every major political donor in Massachusetts. Media coverage. The perfect stage. You want me to show up there? I want you to walk in on my arm wearing diamonds and confidence and the kind of power that makes men like Richard Carlyle realize exactly how badly they miscalculated." Lucien moved closer, his shadow falling across the desk. But only if you choose it. Only if you're certain. Sarah looked at the contract spread before her, at the bank statement with impossible numbers, at Elena's clinical expression and Lucien's dark eyes that never seemed to miss anything. This was insane. Marrying a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. Entering a world she didn't understand. Becoming part of something that lived in shadows and debt collection and the kind of power that required lawyers who looked at $5 million like it was lunch money. But staying in Boston as herself, as the humiliated ex-fiancé, meant watching Nathaniel and his family win. Meant living with the weight of public shame. Meant being small and forgettable and exactly what they'd tried to make her. "Where do I sign?" Sarah asked. Elena allowed herself the smallest smile. She produced a pen. Heavy, expensive, the kind people used for important documents, and began walking Sarah through the contracts page by page. It took an hour. Sarah signed her name so many times it started looking unfamiliar. Initials here, full signature there. Witnesses required for certain pages. Elena called in 2 staff members who appeared, signed, and vanished without making eye contact. When it was finished, Elena gathered the contracts with efficient satisfaction. "Congratulations, Miss Whitmore," she said. "You're now legally protected by the DeLuca organization. I'll file the marriage license today. The ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "Time is essential," Elena said simply. "The longer we wait, the more opportunity the Carlyles have to control the narrative. Mr. DeLuca wants you legally protected as quickly as possible." She left with the contracts, leaving Sarah and Lucien alone in the office, with the ocean crashing below and reality settling over Sarah like weight she wasn't sure she could carry. Lucien moved to the desk, leaning against it with casual grace that somehow made him look more dangerous instead of relaxed. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "I'm having about 50 thoughts." Sarah stood, needing to move. She walked to the windows, pressing her palms against the glass. The Atlantic stretched forever, gray and cold and indifferent. "I don't know anything about you, your family, your business, what I'm actually walking into." "My family is dead," Lucien said bluntly. "My father built the organization. My uncle expanded it. They both died before I turned 30. One from cancer, one from a bullet meant for me. I inherited everything, rebuilt it, made it stronger. That was 15 years ago." Sarah turned to face him. "What exactly is the organization?" "We facilitate transactions that exist in gray areas. Real estate acquisitions where sellers need encouragement. Loans for people banks won't touch. Security services for clients who require discretion. Import-export arrangements that benefit from minimal government oversight." Lucien held her gaze. "We're not saints, but we're not animals either. There are rules, lines we don't cross." "Like what? No human trafficking, no drugs that destroy communities, no business with anyone who harms children." His expression hardened. "Those are absolutes. Everything else is negotiable depending on circumstance." Sarah's mouth went dry. "And the Carlyles crossed a line. The Carlyles took money they couldn't repay and thought their political connections would protect them. They were wrong." Lucien moved closer. "But that's not why I'm doing this. I could collect the debt a dozen different ways. I'm doing this because watching you flee that cathedral yesterday reminded me of someone." "Who?" "My mother." Lucien's voice went flat. "She married my father thinking he was a legitimate businessman. By the time she realized what his empire actually was, she was already trapped. Pregnant. No money of her own. No way out. She spent 20 years trying to be perfect enough to earn his respect. It destroyed her slowly. When she finally died, it was almost a relief." Sarah's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be smart. Be careful. Be someone who understands that power is the only thing that keeps you from becoming a victim." Lucien stopped close enough that Sarah could see gold flecks in his dark eyes. "You asked why I'm giving you $5 million. That's why. So you never have to stay anywhere out of desperation. So you always have a choice. Even if that choice is leaving you. Especially then." They stood in silence, broken only by waves and wind against glass. Sarah tried to reconcile the man offering her freedom with the man who ran an organization built on fear and control. Tried to understand why someone who dealt in violence and debt collection would care about giving her options. The wedding, Sarah said finally. What happens? Small ceremony, tomorrow evening? Gardens if weather permits, library if it doesn't. Witnesses from my organization, legal officiant, binding vows. Lucian's expression softened slightly. I won't expect anything from you beyond what the contracts specify. Separate bedrooms. Separate lives within the same house. You're not a prisoner here. Just a wife. Just a partner in revenge. Lucian smiled, sharp and cold. The Carlyles wanted to erase you. We're going to make sure they never forget your name. A knock on the door interrupted them. A woman entered, early 30s, dark hair and a sleek ponytail, wearing tailored pants and a silk blouse that screamed expensive simplicity. She carried a tablet and moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly where she belonged. This is Veronica, Lucian said. She manages the household and will help you transition. Veronica's smile was professional and genuine. Ms. Whitmore, I've prepared your rooms. If you'll follow me? Sarah glanced at Lucian. He nodded once, permission or reassurance, she couldn't tell which. She followed Veronica out of the office, through more hallways that twisted and turned, up the curved staircase to the second floor. The eastern wing, Veronica explained, private, away from guest quarters and staff areas. The suite Veronica opened was bigger than Sarah's entire apartment in Dorchester. Sitting room with furniture that looked antique and probably was. Bedroom with a four-poster bed and windows overlooking the ocean. Bathroom with marble everywhere, and a tub deep enough to drown in. Walk-in closet already filled with clothes in her size, dresses, pants, shoes, everything organized by color and style. Mr. DeLuca had stylists prepare options based on your measurements and preferences, Veronica said, noticing Sarah's expression. If anything doesn't fit or isn't to your taste, we'll replace it immediately. How did he know my preferences? Veronica's smile didn't waver. Mr. DeLuca is very thorough, which wasn't an answer but told Sarah everything she needed to know. Lucian had been watching her for months, long enough to know not just her measurements but her style, the colors she gravitated toward, the cuts that made her feel confident instead of costumed. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt like being seen. There's a schedule on the desk, Veronica continued. Fittings this afternoon for the wedding dress. Stylist at 4. Dinner is at 7 in the small dining room. Just you and Mr. DeLuca unless you prefer to eat alone. If you need anything, there's an intercom system. She demonstrated the panel beside the bed. Just press the button and someone will respond immediately. Thank you, Sarah managed. Veronica left with the same efficient grace she'd entered with, closing the door softly behind her. Sarah stood in the center of the suite and felt the full weight of what she'd just done crash over her. 24 hours ago, she'd been standing at an altar in a dress she'd saved for, believing she was about to marry someone who loved her. Now she was in a mansion overlooking the Atlantic, preparing to marry a man who ran an organization built on violence and debt collection, all in the name of revenge. She wasn't sure she was strong enough to execute. Her phone buzzed. Sarah pulled it from her pocket, half expecting another message from Nathaniel or a friend asking if she was okay. Instead, it was an email notification. Bank of America. Account activity. She opened it with shaking hands. Deposit $5 million. The money was real. The contracts were real. Tomorrow she would become Sarah DeLuca, and there would be no going back. Sarah sat on the edge of the massive bed and finally let herself cry. Not the broken sobs from yesterday. These were different, angrier, full of grief for the person she'd been and the future she'd imagined, and the naive belief that love could actually save you from a world designed to grind you down. When she finished, her face was blotchy and her chest ached, but something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't the woman who'd fled the cathedral anymore. She was becoming someone else, someone harder, someone who understood that power mattered more than love, because love could be manufactured, but power couldn't be faked. The afternoon passed in a blur of appointments. A tailor arrived with 3 wedding dress options. Elegant, simple, nothing like the ivory monstrosity she'd worn yesterday. Sarah chose a slip dress in champagne silk that made her look older, sophisticated, like someone who belonged in places like this. The stylist came next. A woman named Margot who studied Sarah's face with an artist's intensity, before declaring her bone structure criminale and immediately setting to work. She cut Sarah's hair, just enough to sharpen the angles, changed the color slightly, adding dimension that caught light, shaped her eyebrows into weapons. When Margot finished, Sarah stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not transformed, just sharpened, defined, like someone had taken an unfinished sketch and added the lines that made it matter. "Bellissima," Margot declared. "Mr. DeLuca will be very pleased." Sarah didn't ask how Margot knew what pleased Lucian. Didn't want to think about what other women had sat in this chair, receiving the same treatment, becoming beautiful enough to belong in his world. By the time she made it to dinner, Sarah's nerves were stretched thin as wire. The small dining room turned out to be a corner space with windows on two sides and a table that could seat 8 but was set for 2. Candles flickered despite the overhead lighting. Wine was already poured, red, expensive looking. Lucian stood when she entered. He'd changed into dark pants and a black shirt that made him look like he'd stepped out of some Italian crime film. His eyes swept over her, taking in the new hair, the dress Veronica had selected, the way Sarah held herself differently after a day of being reshaped. "You look—" He paused. "Dangerous." "Is that a compliment?" "The highest one I know how to give." Lucienne pulled out her chair. Sarah sat, hyper-aware of how close he stood, how his fingers brushed her shoulder as he pushed the chair in. Dinner was already plated, something elegant Sarah didn't have the appetite to identify. She picked at it while Lucian watched her with that same unnerving focus. "You're not eating," he observed. "I'm not hungry." "You're terrified." Sarah set down her fork. "Wouldn't you be?" "Probably," Lucian sipped his wine. "But I'd also be exhilarated. You're about to step into a life most people can't imagine. Power, resources, the ability to shape your own future instead of letting others shape it for you. I'm also about to marry a stranger. We won't be strangers for long." Lucien leaned back in his chair. "Ask me anything. No secrets tonight." Sarah studied him across the candlelight, the sharp angles of his face, the casual way he inhabited expensive clothes like they were armor, the intelligence in his eyes that suggested he was always thinking 3 steps ahead. "Why me?" she asked. "Really, not the revenge angle. Not because I'm useful leverage against the Carlyles. Why did you actually offer this to me?" Lucian was quiet for a long moment. "Because when I watched you run from that cathedral," he said finally, "I saw someone who'd been systematically destroyed by people who should have protected her. And I recognized that look, that particular kind of devastation that comes from trusting the wrong people with your heart." He met her eyes. "I told you about my mother. What I didn't tell you is that I watched her shrink herself for 20 years trying to earn love from a man who was incapable of giving it. When she died, I promised myself I would never let that happen to anyone I had the power to protect." "You don't know me well enough to protect me. I know you well enough to see potential everyone else missed. I know you're stronger than you've been allowed to be. I know that given the right resources, you could become extraordinary." Lucien's voice dropped lower. "And yes, you're useful to me. The Carlyles owe me money and you're perfect leverage. But that's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I want to see what you become when you stop apologizing for existing." Sarah's throat tightened. No one had ever talked about her potential before, about what she could become instead of what she currently was. "Tomorrow," she said, "after the wedding. What happens then? We start preparing you for the fundraiser, wardrobe, backstory, how to move through rooms full of people who will try to intimidate you, how to smile like you belong while knowing you could destroy any of them with a single phone call." Lucien smiled slightly. "How to be someone the Carlyles never saw coming. And tonight? Tonight you rest. Tomorrow you become my wife. And 3 weeks from now you walk into that fundraiser and show Nathaniel Carlyle exactly what he lost." They finished dinner in comfortable silence. When Sarah stood to leave, Lucien stood with her. "Sarah," he said as she reached the door. She turned back. "You can still leave," Lucian said quietly. "The money is yours regardless. I meant what I said about choice." Sarah looked at him standing in candlelight, dangerous and honest and offering her a kind of power she'd never imagined possessing. "I know," she said, but I'm staying." His expression shifted, surprise maybe, or respect. Then welcome to the DeLuca Empire, Lucian said. Tomorrow, it becomes yours too. Sarah left before she could change her mind. Back in her suite, she stood at the windows overlooking the Atlantic and thought about the woman she'd been yesterday. Naive, hopeful, believing love mattered more than power. That woman was gone, burned away in the cathedral along with the wedding dress and the future she'd imagined. The woman who would wake up tomorrow was someone else entirely. Someone who understood that survival required sharp edges and cold calculations. Someone willing to marry a stranger for revenge. Someone who'd finally stopped running from her own potential. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened Instagram one last time. The posts about her humiliation were still circulating, still trending, still turning her into a punchline for people who'd never bothered learning her name. She typed out a message to Nathaniel, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, she settled on something simple. You should have married me when you had the chance. She hit send before she could reconsider. Then she blocked his number, blocked his family, blocked everyone connected to the life she was leaving behind. When she woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through windows overlooking an ocean that belonged to her now, or at least to the man she was about to marry. Veronica knocked at 8 with breakfast and a schedule that made Sarah's head spin. Hair and makeup at 10, final dress fitting at noon, lunch with Elena to review legal documents one more time, then the ceremony at 6. Sarah moved through it all in a daze. Let people primp and polish her. Let Elena walk her through financial documents that made her a legitimate part of the DeLuca empire. Let Veronica dress her in champagne silk and heirloom diamonds that probably cost more than most houses. By 5:30, Sarah stood in front of a full-length mirror and didn't recognize herself. The woman looking back was elegant, sophisticated, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth or innocence and everything to do with edges sharp enough to cut. You look like you could rule the world, Veronica said softly. I look like I could survive it, Sarah corrected. Sometimes that's the same thing. The ceremony was held in the library. Rain had started that afternoon, the kind of cold November downpour that turned everything gray and miserable. But inside, the library glowed with candlelight and the warmth of books that lined every wall from floor to ceiling. 20 people filled the space. Staff Sarah didn't know. Elena, with her clinical expression. A handful of men in expensive suits who studied Sarah with the kind of assessment that made her feel like a new acquisition being evaluated. And Lucian. He stood beside the library fireplace in a charcoal suit that made him look like something out of a different era. No tie. White shirt open at the collar. His dark eyes found Sarah the instant she entered and didn't leave her face as she walked toward him. The officiant was a woman in her 60s who spoke with quiet authority. She didn't ask if anyone objected, didn't waste time with sentimental language about love and forever. Just vows, legal, binding, permanent. Sarah spoke hers in a voice that only shook slightly, promised to honor the contract they'd signed, to be a partner in this arrangement, to protect the interests of the organization she was joining. Lucien's vows were similar, clinical, businesslike, until the very end when he added something that wasn't in any contract. I promise to make sure no one ever makes you feel powerless again, he said quietly, just for her. Then Elena produced rings, simple platinum bands that probably cost a fortune, but looked deliberately understated. Lucian slid one onto Sarah's finger. His hands were steady, warm. She slid the other onto his and felt the weight of finality settle over both of them. You may now kiss, the officiant said. Lucian stepped closer. His hand came up to cup Sarah's jaw, thumb brushing her cheekbone. His eyes asked a question she didn't know how to answer. Then he kissed her. Not for show, not for the witnesses, just for them. His mouth was warm and certain, and somehow gentle despite everything Sarah knew about him. The kiss lasted 3 seconds, 4. Long enough for Sarah to feel the chemistry she'd been trying to ignore since the moment he'd wrapped a handkerchief around her bleeding palm. When he pulled back, his eyes had darkened. Hello, Mrs. DeLuca, he murmured. Sarah's breath caught. Hello? The witnesses applauded politely. Elena produced champagne. Someone made a toast Sarah didn't hear over the roaring in her ears. She was married. To a man she barely knew. In a world she didn't understand. For revenge against people who'd barely given her a second thought. Later, after champagne and polite congratulations and witnesses dispersing back to whatever roles they filled in Lucian's empire, Sarah found herself alone with her husband in the library while rain hammered the windows. "Are you all right?" Lucian asked. Sarah laughed. It came out shaky. "I have no idea." "That's fair." He poured them both more champagne, handed her a glass. "For what it's worth, you handled that with more grace than most people manage at their first family wedding. Your organization isn't a family, it's a business." "It's both. That's what makes it dangerous." Lucian clinked his glass against hers. "To revenge." "To survival," Sarah corrected. They drank. Outside, lightning split the sky over the Atlantic. Thunder followed close enough to rattle the windows. Inside, Sarah DeLuca stood in a library full of books she'd never read, wearing a ring that meant everything and nothing, married to a man who terrified and fascinated her in equal measure. And for the first time since the cathedral, she felt something other than rage. She felt ready. "The fundraiser," Sarah said. "Tell me everything I need to know." Lucian's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Now you're speaking my language," he said. He spent the next hour walking her through it. The Carlisle fundraiser was 3 weeks away at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. 500 guests. Politicians. Donors, media. Nathaniel would be there as his father's surrogate, playing the dutiful son supporting his father's Senate campaign. "We'll arrive late," Lucian explained. "Let them get comfortable. Let the champagne flow. Let Nathaniel think he's safe. Then we make our entrance." "And say what?" "We don't say anything at first, we just exist. You on my arm. Wearing something that makes every woman in that room jealous, and every man regret not seeing you first. We let them whisper, let them wonder, let the rumors build. Then I have a conversation with Senator Carlisle about his debt, loud enough for the right people to overhear, specific enough to be damaging, vague enough to avoid immediate legal consequences." Lucian's eyes glittered. "He'll try to deny it. I'll produce documents. Lawyers will get involved. Media will smell blood." "And Nathaniel?" "Nathaniel will try to approach you. He won't be able to help himself. He'll want to explain, to apologize, to make himself feel better about what he did." Lucian moved closer. "That's when you destroy him. Not with violence, with indifference. You look at him like he's nothing, like he never mattered, like marrying me was the best decision you ever made." Sarah's pulse hammered. "What if I can't pull it off?" "You will." Lucian's voice was absolute certainty. "Because you're not pretending anymore. You're not playing a role. You're becoming exactly who you were always meant to be." Thunder crashed again, closer this time. "I should let you rest," Lucian said, stepping back. "Tomorrow we start your real education." "Education in what?" "Power." He smiled. "How to wield it, how to recognize it in others, how to walk into rooms and make people afraid of you without ever raising your voice." He left before Sarah could respond, closing the library door softly behind him. Sarah stood alone in candlelight and rain shadow, wearing a wedding ring that felt heavier than it should, carrying a new name that tasted like smoke and possibility. She pulled out her phone. No messages, no missed calls. The world had moved on from her humiliation already, onto newer scandals and fresher disasters, but in 3 weeks they'd remember her name again, not as the abandoned bride, as the woman who'd risen from the ashes wearing diamonds and danger, married to a man whose name made Boston's elite nervous, ready to burn the Carlisle empire down until nothing remained but smoke and regret. Sarah walked to the library windows and pressed her palm against cold glass. Outside, the Atlantic raged against the cliffs, indifferent to human drama. Inside, a new kind of storm was building. And when it finally broke, Nathaniel Carlisle would realize he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Not because he'd humiliated her, because he'd underestimated what she'd become when someone finally gave her permission to stop being small. Sarah DeLuca smiled at her reflection in rain-dark glass. Then she went upstairs to her suite and started planning exactly how she'd make them all pay. The next 3 weeks passed in a fever dream of transformation. Every morning, Sarah woke to Veronica's precise schedule delivered with coffee and efficiency. Breakfast at 7. Language lessons at 8. Italian, because Lucien insisted she needed to understand conversations happening around her in his world. At 10, Elena arrived with legal documents, teaching Sarah the architecture of the DeLuca Empire in clinical detail. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, real estate holdings that stretched across 3 continents. All of it legitimate on paper. All of it built on foundations Sarah was learning not to examine too closely. Afternoons belonged to Marcus. He was Lucian's head of security, a former Marine with scars on his knuckles and eyes that missed nothing. He taught Sarah how to read rooms, how to identify exits, how to recognize when someone was armed, how to move through crowds like she belonged while staying aware of everyone watching. "You're a target now," Marcus explained during their first session. "Mrs. DeLuca isn't just a name. It's a statement. People will want to test you, intimidate you, see if you're real or just another trophy wife playing dress-up. And if they try," Marcus smiled, cold and professional, "you make them regret it without ever losing your composure. That's the real power. Not violence, control." Sarah learned quickly how to hold eye contact until the other person looked away first, how to smile in a way that promised nothing, how to use silence as a weapon, how to walk into a room and claim it before speaking a single word. At night, she had dinner with Lucien, sometimes in the formal dining room with Elena and other members of his organization, sometimes in the small corner space where they'd eaten their first meal, sometimes not at all when Lucien disappeared into his office for hours, managing problems Sarah wasn't cleared to know about yet. But when they did eat together, he studied her with the same intensity as always, asked about her lessons, corrected her Italian pronunciation, shared stories about the people they'd encounter at the fundraiser, who mattered, who was dangerous, who could be bought, and who couldn't. "Senator Carlyle's biggest donor is a man named Gregory Thorne," Lucian said one evening over wine that probably cost more than Sarah's old monthly rent. "Real estate developer, 3 ex-wives. Rumored to have mob connections he denies publicly. He's the one who introduced the senator to me when they needed money." "Is he loyal to Carlyle?" "He's loyal to profit. When the senator's campaign collapses, Thorne will be the first one to distance himself." Lucian's smile was sharp. "That's the beautiful thing about men like him. They have no principles, only interests." Sarah absorbed it all: names, connections, weak points. She filled notebooks with information that would have terrified her a month ago. Now it just felt like studying for the most important exam of her life. The wedding ring on her finger grew familiar. So did the weight of being Sarah DeLuca. She hadn't spoken to anyone from her old life, hadn't returned calls from the 2 roommates wondering where she'd disappeared to, hadn't checked social media since the wedding. That version of herself felt distant now, unreal, like a story that had happened to someone else. 10 days before the fundraiser, Lucien took her to Boston, not for pleasure, for reconnaissance. They drove into the city in the Rolls-Royce, Marcus at the wheel, Lucian beside Sarah in the back seat. He dressed her carefully that morning, tailored black pants, cashmere sweater, coat that probably cost 5 figures, hair pulled into a low ponytail, minimal jewelry except for the wedding ring and diamond studs that caught light like warnings. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. "Your old neighborhood," Lucien said. "I want you to see what you left behind. Remember why we're doing this." They drove through Dorchester, past the diner where Sarah had worked double shifts, past the apartment building where she'd shared a cramped bedroom with 2 other women, past the laundromat where she'd spent Sunday mornings because it was cheaper than the machines in her building. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, dirtier, more desperate. Sarah stared out the window at people hurrying through November cold, heads down, shoulders hunched against wind that felt colder when you couldn't afford a proper coat. She'd been one of them 4 weeks ago, invisible, struggling, believing hard work and good intentions would somehow be enough. "Feel anything?" Lucian asked. Sarah considered the question, expected to feel nostalgia, maybe guilt. Instead, she felt something closer to relief. "I feel like I escaped," she admitted. "Good. That's the truth. You didn't lose anything when you left this behind. You gained everything." Lucian's hand found hers on the seat between them. "Remember that when we walk into the Fairmont, when people try to make you feel like you don't belong. You belong more than any of them because you earned your place. They were just born into theirs." They drove next to Beacon Hill, past brownstones with window boxes and doormen, past the street where Nathaniel's family kept their townhouse, 4 stories of Federal-era architecture and old money. A black SUV was parked outside. Security, probably. Senator Carlisle took his safety seriously now that his campaign was gaining traction. He's desperate, Lucian said, following Sarah's gaze. The senator. He's called me 17 times in the past 2 weeks. Left messages. Had lawyers reach out. He knows the debt is overdue, and he knows I'm done negotiating. What did you tell him? Nothing. Silence is its own message. Lucian smiled. He'll see us at the fundraiser. That's when he'll understand exactly how badly he miscalculated. They ate lunch at a restaurant Sarah had always wanted to try but could never afford. The kind of place where the menu didn't list prices and the waitstaff moved with choreographed precision. Lucian ordered for both of them in Italian that made the server's eyes light with approval. Sarah picked at food she couldn't taste. Her stomach was twisted too tight with anticipation and dread. Nervous? Lucian asked. Terrified. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Overconfidence gets you killed. He leaned back, studying her across the table. You've done well these past weeks. Better than I expected. You expected me to fail? I expected you to struggle more, to question whether you were capable. Instead, you absorbed everything Marcus and Elena taught you, like you'd been preparing for this your entire life. Lucian's expression shifted into something Sarah couldn't quite read. You're a natural at this. At power. At control. It makes me wonder what you would have become if you'd had resources earlier. Sarah's throat tightened. Someone very different. Maybe, or maybe exactly who you're becoming now. Lucian signaled for the check. Either way, the Carlyles created their own nightmare when they underestimated you. They drove back to the estate as afternoon light turned gray. Sarah dozed in the car, exhausted from weeks of intensive preparation. When she woke, Lucian was watching her with an expression that made her chest constrict. What? She asked. Nothing. Just thinking. About? About how strange it is to marry someone for strategy and discover you actually respect them. Sarah's breath caught. Before she could respond, Marcus pulled up to the estate entrance and the moment dissolved. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom windows watching waves crash against the cliffs below, mind racing through everything she'd learned, every name, every connection, every weak point in the Carlyle empire they were about to exploit. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Come in, Sarah called. Lucian entered carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. He wore dark pants and a t-shirt, casual in a way she'd never seen him. His hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. His feet were bare against the hardwood floor. Saw your light on, he said, offering her a glass. Figured you were overthinking. Sarah accepted the whiskey. Is that what you do when you can't sleep? Wander the house, offering alcohol? Usually I work, but tonight felt different. Lucian moved to the window beside her. They stood in silence, drinking expensive whiskey and watching the ocean rage in darkness. Having second thoughts? About the fundraiser? About any of it. The marriage, the revenge, becoming someone you weren't 4 weeks ago. Sarah considered lying, decided against it. Every day, she admitted. I wake up in this house wearing these clothes, living this life, and sometimes I can't remember who I was before. It terrifies me. That's not a bad thing. The person you were before was surviving. Now you're living. There's a difference. Is there? Or am I just trading one kind of cage for another? Lucian turned to face her fully. You think you're caged here? I think I signed contracts that bind me to an organization I still don't fully understand. I think I married a man I barely know. I think I'm about to walk into a room full of people who will see right through me. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. I think I'm terrified of failing, of being exposed as exactly what I am. A waitress from Dorchester playing dress-up in a world I don't belong in. Stop. Lucian's voice was sharp enough to cut. He set down his glass and gripped Sarah's shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. You're not playing dress-up. You're not pretending. Every lesson you absorbed, every skill you learned, every instinct you developed, that's real. That's you. The cage wasn't this estate. The cage was the life you lived before. Small, apologetic, trying to earn love from people who saw you as disposable. Then why do I still feel like I'm drowning? Because transformation is violent. Because becoming powerful means killing the parts of yourself that were weak. It's supposed to hurt. His grip gentianed but didn't release. But you're not drowning. You're learning to breathe underwater. And when we walk into that fundraiser, everyone will see it. Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the certainty he carried like armor. Instead, she just felt exhausted. Lucien seemed to sense this. He released her shoulders and picked up his glass. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "We have dress fittings tomorrow. Then final preparations. 5 days until we destroy everything the Carlyles built." He left before Sarah could respond. She stood alone at the window with half-finished whiskey and doubts that wouldn't quiet, wondering if she was actually becoming powerful or just becoming someone else's weapon. The next 5 days blurred together. Final fittings for the dress she'd wear to the fundraiser. Midnight blue silk that made her look like she'd stepped out of some film noir fantasy. Jewelry selected by Lucien himself, diamonds and sapphires that probably cost more than most people's houses. Shoes that added 3 inches and made her feel like she could conquer continents. Elena drilled her on potential questions. Lucien rehearsed conversations. Marcus made her practice walking into rooms and claiming space with nothing but presence. By the morning of the fundraiser, Sarah felt like a weapon that had been sharpened for weeks and was finally ready to draw blood. She spent the afternoon alone trying to calm nerves that wouldn't settle. Veronica brought lunch Sarah couldn't eat. Margot arrived at 3 to work on hair and makeup, something elegant and severe that made Sarah's bone structure look like it had been carved from marble. At 5, Veronica helped her into the midnight blue dress. It fit like it had been designed specifically for her body, which it had. Strapless, form-fitting through the bodice before falling in elegant lines to the floor. A slit up one thigh that was suggestive without being obvious. The back dipped low enough to reveal skin and the tattoo Sarah had gotten at 19, a small constellation between her shoulder blades that no one except Nathaniel had ever seen. The diamonds came next. Necklace, earrings, bracelet. Each piece was individually insured for amounts that made Sarah dizzy. When Veronica stepped back, Sarah looked at herself in the full-length mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. This wasn't the waitress from Dorchester. This wasn't even the woman who'd fled the cathedral 4 weeks ago. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Someone who looked like she belonged in rooms where power was currency and mercy was weakness. "Mr. DeLuca is waiting downstairs," Veronica said softly. "Are you ready?" Sarah took one last look at her reflection. "Yes," she lied. Lucien stood in the foyer wearing a tuxedo that made him look like he'd stepped out of some Italian dynasty. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His expression was controlled. But when Sarah descended the stairs, something shifted in his eyes. He didn't speak until she reached the bottom step. "You're going to destroy every person in that room," Lucien said quietly, "and you won't even have to try." Marcus held the door. The Rolls-Royce waited outside, polished to a mirror shine. Lucien helped Sarah into the back seat, his hand warm against hers, steady despite what they were about to do. The drive to Boston felt both endless and too short. Sarah watched the city approach through tinted windows, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lucien sat beside her in silence, his presence a constant reassurance. When they hit traffic near the Fairmont, he finally spoke. "Last chance to back out," he said. Sarah looked at him. At this man who'd appeared out of nowhere and offered her power disguised as revenge. This stranger who'd become her husband. This dangerous person who'd somehow made her feel safer than anyone else ever had. "I'm not backing out," she said. "Good." Lucien's smile was predatory. "Then let's show Boston who you really are." The Fairmont Copley Plaza rose before them, lit up like a monument to wealth and influence. The entrance was packed with expensive cars and people in evening wear. Photographers clustered near the doors, cameras ready to capture Boston's elite at their most performative. Marcus pulled up to the entrance but didn't stop at the valet stand. He drove past it, circling the block while they waited. Lucien checked his watch, checked it again. "What are we waiting for?" Sarah asked. "Timing. I want the cocktail hour in full swing. I want everyone comfortable. I want Nathaniel relaxed." Lucien's eyes glittered. "I want them to forget for just a moment that power is fragile and reputations are built on sand." They circled twice more before Lucien finally nodded. Marcus pulled up to the entrance. A valet rushed forward, Photographers turned, cameras lifting automatically toward the Rolls-Royce. Marcus opened the door, and Lucien stepped out first, buttoning his tuxedo jacket with practiced ease. Then he extended his hand toward Sarah. She took it and stepped into the flashbulbs. Cameras exploded with light. Voices called questions Sarah didn't process. She focused on Lucien's hand at the small of her back, guiding her forward, steady and certain. They moved through the photographers like royalty, not stopping, not posing, just existing in a way that made everyone else fade to background noise. Inside, the ballroom was exactly as opulent as Sarah expected. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, windows overlooking Copley Square. 500 people in formal wear clustered in groups, drinks in hand, conversations flowing with the practiced ease of people who'd known each other for decades. Politicians. Donors. The kind of money that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. The room didn't stop when Sarah and Lucien entered, but conversations stuttered, heads turned, and like dominoes falling, awareness spread through the crowd. Sarah felt every eye land on her, felt the weight of recognition, felt whispers starting like fire catching dry timber. That's her. That's Sarah Whitmore, the abandoned bride. What is she doing here? Who is that man? Is that Lucien De Luca? Why would she be with him? How long has this been? Lucien's hand tightened slightly at Sarah's back. Reassurance. Reminder. They walked deeper into the ballroom with deliberate slowness. Sarah kept her expression neutral, her spine straight, her chin high. She'd practiced this moment for weeks, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of being examined by hundreds of people who remembered her humiliation. A server appeared with champagne. Lucien took 2 glasses, handed one to Sarah. They touched the rims together with a soft clink that somehow carried through the murmurs. "Breathe," Lucien said quietly. Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath. She released it slowly, sipped champagne that tasted like expensive bubbles and imminent destruction. Then she saw him. Nathaniel. He stood near the far end of the ballroom with a cluster of young professionals, campaign staffers probably. He wore a navy suit that made him look senatorial. His golden hair was perfectly styled. He was laughing at something someone said, drink in hand, the picture of confidence and privilege. Then he saw her. The laughter died on his face. The drink in his hand tilted dangerously. Someone beside him said something, but Nathaniel didn't respond. His eyes locked on Sarah with an expression that cycled through shock, confusion, and something that might have been panic. Sarah smiled. Not warmly, not with any trace of the girl who'd once loved him. Just a cold acknowledgement that she'd seen him and wasn't afraid. Nathaniel broke away from his group immediately, moving toward her with the single-minded determination of someone about to make a catastrophic mistake. "Let him come," Lucien murmured. "This is what we wanted." Nathaniel cut through the crowd, excusing himself past donors and politicians who tried to intercept him. When he finally reached Sarah and Lucien, his face was flushed, his confidence visibly shaken. "Sarah," he said, "what are you doing here?" "Attending a fundraiser with my husband." Sarah's voice was calm, almost bored. "What are you doing here, Nathaniel?" His eyes flicked to Lucien, recognition and fear warring on his face. "Your husband?" Nathaniel's voice cracked slightly. "Lucien De Luca." Lucien extended his hand with predatory courtesy. "We haven't been formally introduced, though I know your father quite well." Nathaniel didn't take the offered hand. "This is insane. Sarah, you can't marry someone 4 weeks after you humiliated me in front of 200 people?" Sarah's voice stayed level, but ice crept into every word. "After you used me as a prop for your father's campaign and then discarded me on camera? That's what you were going to say, right?" People nearby were definitely listening now. Conversations had stopped completely in their immediate vicinity. Phones were coming out. This was going to be online within minutes. "I didn't mean," Nathaniel started. "Yes, you did." Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice to something intimate and devastating. "You meant every word. You and your mother planned it, used me, made me believe I actually mattered to you, and when I was no longer useful, you threw me away like garbage." "That's not fair, Yates." "What's not fair?" Lucien interrupted, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the growing audience. "Is your father borrowing $12 million from me and failing to repay it? What's not fair is thinking political connections would protect him from consequences. What's not fair is using my wife, Nathaniel, as a disposable tool and believing there wouldn't be repercussions. Nathaniel's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Lucian smiled. Then perhaps you should ask Senator Carlisle. I'm sure he'd love to explain where he got the money to fund his primary campaign. Or we could discuss it here. I have documentation, witnesses, bank records, whatever you prefer. The color drained further from Nathaniel's face. Behind him, Sarah saw movement. His father, Senator Richard Carlisle, pushing through the crowd with Patricia at his side. Both looked furious. Both looked terrified. This was it. The moment they'd planned for. The moment Sarah had dreamed about during 3 weeks of preparation. And then something impossible happened. A voice cut through the tension. Actually, I think we should discuss it right here. Sarah turned and felt her entire world tilt sideways. Elena Marchetti stood 5 feet away, no longer wearing her clinical lawyer expression. Instead, she looked triumphant, victorious, and behind her stood a man in his 60s with silver hair and a face Sarah had seen in dozens of photos over the past 3 weeks. Gregory Thorne, Senator Carlisle's biggest donor. The man Lucien had assured her would abandon the senator when things went south. But he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 4 men in suits who moved like law enforcement, and they were walking straight toward Lucien. Lucien de Luca, one of them said, pulling out a badge. FBI, you're under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The ballroom erupted. Sarah's champagne glass slipped from her numb fingers and shattered on marble. She turned to Lucien, expecting denial, expecting fight, expecting something other than the expression on his face. He looked resigned, like he'd been expecting this. Lucien, Sarah's voice came out broken. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. Or wouldn't. The agents moved in, pulling out handcuffs with practiced efficiency. People were shouting, cameras were flashing. The entire fundraiser had descended into chaos, but Sarah couldn't process any of it because her world was collapsing again. Worse than the cathedral. Worse than anything she'd imagined. Elena stepped closer to Sarah, her expression no longer clinical. Now it was pitying. I'm sorry, Elena said quietly. But you were never part of the plan. You were always just leverage, a distraction. Lucien knew the FBI was closing in weeks ago. He married you to legitimize his assets, to move money through your accounts, to create a legal shield when everything fell apart. Sarah couldn't breathe. That's not true. It is. Check your bank accounts. The ones he set up for you. They're full of laundered money, transactions you never authorized, transfers that implicate you in every crime he's committed for the past 15 years. Elena's voice was almost gentle. You're not his wife. You're his scapegoat. And when this goes to trial, you'll go down with him unless you cooperate. The agents were leading Lucien toward the exit. He didn't struggle, didn't protest, just walked with the same calm he'd shown when offering Sarah revenge, when promising her power, when standing beside her in the library and calling her his wife. Lucien! Sarah screamed. He stopped, turned. Their eyes met across the chaos, and Sarah saw the truth in his expression. Guilt, regret, and something that might have been genuine remorse buried under layers of calculation. I'm sorry, he mouthed. Then the agents pushed him forward and he disappeared through the ballroom doors. Sarah stood frozen in midnight blue silk and diamonds that were probably evidence now, surrounded by 500 people capturing her second public destruction on camera, her husband who'd promised to make her powerful, arrested for crimes she didn't understand, implicated in schemes she'd never agreed to, staring at Elena Marchetti, who'd spent 3 weeks teaching her the architecture of an empire that was apparently built entirely on lies. Senator Carlisle appeared at Elena's side, his expression carefully controlled satisfaction. Ms. Whitmore, he said, voice dripping false sympathy, I'm terribly sorry you were caught up in this. Mr. DeLuca is a dangerous man who preys on vulnerable women. I'm sure the authorities will take that into consideration when deciding how to proceed with charges against you. The implication was clear. Cooperate. Testify against Lucien. Become the victim again. Or face decades in prison for crimes she didn't commit. Sarah looked at Patricia Carlisle's triumphant smile, at Nathaniel's shocked face, at Gregory Thorne, who'd apparently been working with the FBI all along, at Elena, who'd betrayed her so completely, Sarah couldn't even process it yet. at the room full of Boston's elite, witnessing her destruction for the second time in a month. Something inside her cracked, not broke, cracked, and through the crack poured rage so pure and cold it felt like clarity. "No," Sarah said. Senator Carlyle blinked. "Excuse me?" "No." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "You think I'm going to roll over again? Play the victim? Let you control this narrative like you controlled everything else?" "Miss Whitmore, you're in shock." "I'm awake." Sarah looked at the FBI agent still lingering near the entrance, at the cameras still recording, at the entire room watching her implode. "And if Lucian DeLuca goes down, I'm taking every single person in this room with him, starting with you, Senator." Richard Carlyle's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake." "No. I made a mistake 4 weeks ago when I believed love mattered more than power. I made a mistake when I trusted anyone in this city to have a conscience." Sarah smiled, cold and sharp, and nothing like the girl who'd fled the cathedral. "But I'm done making mistakes, and I'm definitely done being anyone's victim." She turned and walked toward the exit, head high, spine straight, every lesson Marcus taught her about claiming space and refusing to break on full display. Behind her, chaos erupted. Voices shouting questions, cameras flashing, the entire fundraiser collapsing into the scandal of the decade. But Sarah didn't look back. She walked out of the Fairmont Copley Plaza into freezing November air wearing a dress that was probably evidence and diamonds that weren't hers, and a wedding ring that meant nothing except lies. Marcus was waiting beside the Rolls-Royce. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah saw something in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or just professional assessment of a situation that had gone catastrophically wrong. "Where to?" he asked. Sarah looked at Boston's skyline glittering with indifference, at the life she'd tried to build twice now, and failed both times, at the complete wreckage of every plan, every hope, every naive belief that power could actually save her. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then get in," Marcus said. "We'll figure it out." Sarah climbed into the back seat of a car that belonged to a man currently in FBI custody. Satin leather that smelled like lies and expensive cologne, and the particular kind of devastation that came from believing in someone who'd been using you all along. Marcus pulled away from the Fairmont, and Sarah watched it recede in the side mirror, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the last shred of certainty Sarah had about who she was or who she was supposed to become. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Sarah answered because she had nothing left to lose. "Mrs. DeLuca," a woman's voice said, smooth, professional. "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm an attorney specializing in federal cases. I represent you now." "I didn't hire you." "Mr. DeLuca did, before his arrest. He anticipated this scenario and put measures in place to protect you." A pause. "We need to meet. Tonight. There are things you need to understand before the FBI comes for you, and they will come for you, probably within the hour." Sarah's stomach dropped further. "What kind of things?" "The kind that will determine whether you spend the next 20 years in prison or walk away from this completely." Jennifer's voice was calm, matter of fact. "Your choice. But decide quickly. The clock is already ticking." Sarah looked out the window at Boston racing past, at the city that had destroyed her twice, at the life that kept collapsing no matter how hard she tried to build something stable. "Where do we meet?" she asked. Jennifer gave her an address in Cambridge. Marcus nodded when Sarah relayed it. He knew the location, good neighborhood, public enough to be safe, private enough for the kind of conversation that would determine Sarah's entire future. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sarah said. She hung up and dropped her head back against leather seats that smelled like betrayal. 3 weeks of preparation. 3 weeks of believing she was becoming powerful. 3 weeks of trusting a man who'd apparently been using her from the moment he'd wrapped a handkerchief around her bleeding palm outside the cathedral. Sarah's hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and devastation, and the particular kind of rage that came from realizing you'd been played twice by 2 different men who both saw you as disposable, but this time felt different. This time, Sarah wasn't running. She was walking straight toward whatever came next with her eyes open and her hands ready to fight. Because if Lucian had taught her anything in 3 weeks, it was that power wasn't given. It was taken. And Sarah was done asking permission to survive. The address Jennifer Walsh gave Sarah Belonged to a law office in Cambridge tucked between a bookstore and a coffee shop that was closing for the night. Marcus pulled up to the curb but didn't kill the engine. His eyes swept the street with professional paranoia, cataloging exits and potential threats. "You want me to come in?" he asked. Sarah looked at the lit windows on the second floor, at the silhouette of someone moving behind glass, at the choice she was about to make that would determine whether she spent the next 2 decades in prison or somehow walked away from the wreckage Lucien had left behind. "No," she said. "But stay close." Marcus nodded once. Sarah climbed out of the Rolls-Royce in a dress worth more than most people's cars and diamonds that were probably evidence and walked toward a law office at 9 o'clock at night, because her life had become the kind of chaos that required lawyers who worked after hours. The door was unlocked. Sarah climbed narrow stairs that creaked under her heels, each step feeling like descending deeper into something she couldn't escape. The hallway at the top smelled like coffee and old paper, and the particular kind of desperation that clung to places where people came to fix unfixable problems. Jennifer Walsh waited in the doorway of the last office. She was younger than Sarah expected, mid-30s maybe. Sharp suit, hair pulled into a ponytail that meant business. Eyes that assessed Sarah in 3 seconds flat, and apparently decided she was worth saving. "Mrs. DeLuca," Jennifer said. "Come in." The office was small but efficient. Desk covered in files, computer showing what looked like legal databases, a coat rack holding a raincoat and an umbrella, windows overlooking Cambridge Street where normal people were finishing normal days without federal charges hanging over their heads. Sarah sat in the chair across from Jennifer's desk. Her hands were still shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. Jennifer poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting there for hours, handed Sarah a mug without asking if she wanted it, sat behind her desk with the kind of focused intensity that made Sarah understand why Lucien had hired her. "First question," Jennifer said. "Did you know what Lucien was doing?" "No." "Did you participate in any financial transactions beyond what was outlined in your prenuptial agreement?" "No." "I signed what Elena told me to sign. I didn't—" Sarah's voice cracked. She forced it steady. "I didn't understand what any of it meant beyond protecting myself if we divorced." Jennifer's expression didn't change. She pulled out a tablet, swiped through screens covered in numbers and legal language Sarah couldn't parse. "Here's what the FBI thinks happened," Jennifer said. "They think Lucien married you to create a legal vehicle for moving money. They think he used your name, your social security number, and your signature to open accounts that were funded by illegal operations. They think you were complicit because the money trail leads directly to you." Sarah's stomach twisted. "But I wasn't. I didn't know." "I believe you. The problem is proving it." Jennifer turned the tablet towards Sarah. "These are accounts opened in your name over the past 3 weeks. Total deposits exceed $40 million. All of it came from shell corporations connected to Lucien's organization. All of it moved through banks in Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands before landing in accounts with your name on them." The numbers blurred. Sarah couldn't breathe. "I never authorized any of this." "I know, but your signature is on the account opening documents. Your information is listed as the primary account holder. Legally, you're responsible for everything in those accounts unless we can prove you were coerced or acting under duress." Jennifer leaned forward. "So that's what we're going to prove." "How?" "By making you radioactive to the prosecution. By building a defense so compelling that charging you becomes more trouble than it's worth. By cooperating with the FBI in ways that implicate Lucien without making you look like a co-conspirator." Jennifer's voice was clinical, professional. "But it requires you to do something extremely difficult." Sarah's chest tightened. "What?" "Testify against your husband. Give the FBI everything you know about his organization. Names, operations, conversations. Everything Elena taught you over the past 3 weeks about the structure of the DeLuca empire. You become their star witness against Lucien in exchange for immunity." The office felt too small suddenly, too hot. Sarah stood, needing to move, to breathe, to process what Jennifer was asking. "He used me," Sarah said. "He lied to me. He married me knowing this was coming and used me as a, what did Elena call it? A scapegoat. Why would I protect him?" "You wouldn't. That's my point. You give him up completely. You walk into FBI headquarters tomorrow morning and you tell them everything. You play the victim because you are the victim. You let them see the woman Nathaniel Carlisle humiliated, the woman Lucien DeLuca manipulated, the woman who was used by two different men in the span of a month. You make yourself sympathetic, cooperative, someone the prosecution wants to protect instead of destroy. Sarah stared out the window at Cambridge Street, at people walking home from dinner or bars or wherever normal people went on Thursday nights when their lives weren't imploding. And if I don't? She asked quietly. Then you go down with Lucien, money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy. You're looking at 20 years minimum in federal prison, probably more given the amounts involved. Jennifer stood, moving beside Sarah at the window. I know this isn't what you want to hear. I know testifying against him feels like betrayal. But he betrayed you first. He used you. And if you don't save yourself, no one else will. Sarah's reflection in the window looked like a stranger. Midnight blue silk. Diamonds. Perfect makeup covering devastation. She looked like someone who belonged in ballrooms and mansions and lives that didn't fall apart twice in a month. But underneath, she was still the waitress from Dorchester who'd never learned how to stop trusting the wrong people. When do I have to decide? Sarah asked. Now. The FBI will come for you within the hour, probably to the estate, maybe sooner if they decide you're a flight risk. You need to be prepared with a story that makes you the victim instead of the accomplice. And that means committing to cooperating fully. Sarah turned away from the window, looked at Jennifer Walsh, who was offering her the same thing everyone offered, survival in exchange for betrayal. Except this time, the betrayal felt justified, earned. Lucien had used her. He'd known the FBI was closing in and he'd married her anyway, created a legal maze that trapped her, made her complicit in crimes she didn't understand, all while promising her power and protection and revenge that was always going to end like this, with her destroyed and him in handcuffs. What do I have to do? Sarah asked. Relief flickered across Jennifer's face. First, we call the FBI before they come for you. We tell them you're willing to cooperate. That puts you in control of the narrative from the start. Then tomorrow morning, you go to their field office and you give a statement. Everything you know, everything Elena taught you, everything Lucien said about his operations. And the money in the accounts? We argue you never accessed it. Never knew it existed beyond the initial $5 million outlined in your prenuptial agreement. We show that Lucien controlled everything, that you were a puppet, not a partner. The FBI will probably freeze all the accounts while the investigation continues. You won't see that money, but you also won't go to prison for it. Sarah thought about the past 3 weeks. The lessons, the preparation, Marcus teaching her how to read rooms, Elena explaining the architecture of an empire, Lucien watching her with those dark eyes and promising to make her powerful. All of it lies, all of it manipulation, all of it designed to use her one more time before discarding her when the FBI finally closed in. Make the call, Sarah said. Jennifer didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she apparently had memorized. Waited, then spoke with the kind of professional courtesy that came from doing this 100 times before. This is Jennifer Walsh, representing Sarah DeLuca. My client wishes to cooperate fully with your investigation into Lucien DeLuca and his organization. We'd like to arrange voluntary surrender and a proffer session for tomorrow morning. Pause. Yes, Fatima. She's with me now. Yes, she understands the implications. We'll be at your field office at 8 a.m. She hung up. Done, Jennifer said. You're officially cooperating. They won't arrest you tonight. But Sarah? She waited until Sarah met her eyes. Once you walk into that field office tomorrow, there's no going back. You'll be testifying against your husband, against his entire organization. People who were loyal to Lucien will consider you a traitor. Some of them are dangerous, very dangerous. You need to understand what you're agreeing to. I understand, Sarah said, but she didn't. Not really. She just understood that every choice she'd made for the past month had led here, to this office, with this lawyer, making this decision that felt less like survival and more like drowning in slow motion. Jennifer walked Sarah back downstairs. Marcus was waiting exactly where she'd left him, leaning against the Rolls-Royce with the kind of casual alertness that suggested he knew exactly how bad things had gotten. Take her back to the estate, Jennifer told Marcus. FBI won't come tonight, but stay with her. Don't let her access any computers or phones beyond what's necessary. Nothing that could be construed as destroying evidence or contacting Lucian's associates. Marcus nodded. He opened the car door for Sarah without comment. The drive back to the estate was silent. Sarah stared out the window at darkness and streetlights, and the empty feeling that came from realizing you'd spent 3 weeks becoming someone who didn't actually exist. Someone who was only ever meant to be a legal shield for a man who'd been planning his own arrest since the day he'd offered her a handkerchief outside the cathedral. When they finally pulled up to the estate, the house was dark except for a few security lights. Staff had apparently been told to make themselves scarce. The place felt abandoned, haunted by the ghost of what Sarah had briefly believed could be her life. Marcus walked her inside, checked the main rooms with professional thoroughness, stood in the foyer while Sarah kicked off her heels and felt the marble floor cold against her feet. "You should eat something," Marcus said. "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway. Tomorrow's going to be worse." He disappeared into the kitchen. Sarah heard cabinets opening, the microwave humming. She walked to Lucian's office instead, the corner room with glass walls overlooking the Atlantic. The door was unlocked. The desk was exactly as he'd left it. Computer dark. Papers organized in neat stacks. Everything controlled and deliberate and designed to hide whatever he'd actually been doing. Sarah sat in his chair, ran her hands over the black walnut desk, tried to reconcile the man who'd kissed her in the library with the man who'd apparently been using her as a legal puppet from the moment they'd met. A file folder sat on the corner of the desk. Sarah opened it without thinking and felt her entire world shift again. Inside were photographs, surveillance photos, of her, walking to the diner where she used to work, coming out of her apartment in Dorchester, standing at the bus stop, grocery shopping, living her life completely unaware someone was documenting her every move. The photos were dated. The earliest was from 7 months ago, long before the cathedral, long before Nathaniel, long before Sarah had any idea Lucian DeLuca existed. Her hands shook as she flipped through more photos. Her at the library, her at the laundromat, her sitting in a coffee shop with a book she'd borrowed because she couldn't afford to buy it. Someone had been watching her for 7 months, not weeks, not since Nathaniel's betrayal. 7 months. Beneath the photos were documents, background checks, financial records, interviews with people Sarah knew or used to know. Her former foster sister in Ohio who'd been paid $500 to answer questions about Sarah's childhood. An ex-boyfriend from community college who'd described her as sweet but damaged. A manager from the diner who'd called her hardworking but naive. Lucian hadn't just watched her. He'd studied her, profiled her, chosen her. Sarah's stomach turned. She flipped to the last page in the folder. It was a handwritten note. Lucien's handwriting, she recognized it from contracts she'd signed. Perfect subject. Isolated. Desperate for validation. History of abandonment issues. Will be vulnerable after public humiliation. Recommend approach immediately following cathedral incident. Estimated cooperation. High. Estimated suspicion. Low. The words blurred. Sarah read them again, then again. Perfect subject. Vulnerable. Estimated cooperation. High. Lucien hadn't saved her outside the cathedral. He'd been waiting for her. He'd known Nathaniel was going to humiliate her, known exactly when and how, and he'd positioned himself perfectly to offer rescue to a woman he'd spent 7 months profiling for this exact scenario. Every conversation, every promise, every moment she'd thought he was seeing her, really seeing her, had been manipulation, calculation. A con executed with surgical precision on someone he'd selected specifically because she was isolated and desperate and naive enough to believe a stranger could actually care. Sarah couldn't breathe. The office spun. She dropped the folder and stood, needing to move, needing air, needing something other than this crushing realization that she'd been a mark since the beginning, that everything had been a lie. Marcus appeared in the doorway holding a plate of food Sarah would never eat. "What is it?" he asked, reading her expression. Sarah pointed at the folder with a shaking hand. "Did you know?" Marcus set down the plate and picked up the folder. His expression didn't change as he flipped through it. When he finished, he closed it carefully and looked at Sarah with something that might have been sympathy. "I didn't know the specifics," he said quietly, "but I knew Lucien had been planning something for months. He told me to be ready for a high-priority assignment, that's all." A high-priority assignment? Sarah's voice came out hollow. That's what I was. An assignment. I'm sorry. Sorry? You're sorry. Sarah's control finally snapped. Your boss spent 7 months stalking me. He profiled me like I was some kind of criminal. He waited for me to be humiliated, and then he swooped in playing savior knowing exactly how desperate I'd be. He married me knowing the FBI was coming. He used me to hide money and set me up to take the fall for crimes I didn't commit. And you're sorry? Marcus didn't flinch. Yes. I'm sorry you got caught up in this. I'm sorry Lucien is who he is. I'm sorry this is your life now, but being sorry doesn't change anything. You still have to decide what you're going to do about it. I'm going to destroy him. Sarah's voice was ice. Tomorrow, I'm going to walk into the FBI field office, and I'm going to tell them everything, every lesson Elena taught me, every detail about his organization, every single thing I know, and then I'm going to watch him go to prison for the rest of his life. Good, Marcus said simply. Sarah stared at him. Good? You work for him. I work for whoever pays me, and I've been watching Lucien De Luca make increasingly reckless decisions for the past 2 years. He was always going to end up here. I'm just glad you're smart enough to save yourself instead of going down with him. He picked up the folder. I'll make copies of this. The FBI will want to see it. It proves you were targeted, manipulated. It makes you the victim instead of the accomplice. Marcus left before Sarah could respond. She stood alone in Lucien's office, surrounded by evidence of her own stupidity. Evidence that she'd been played so completely she hadn't even seen it happening. Evidence that the man who'd kissed her in the library and promised to make her powerful had actually just been executing a con that started 7 months ago and was always going to end with her destroyed. Sarah's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered because at this point, what else could go wrong? Sarah Whitmore. The voice was male, unfamiliar. Or should I say Sarah De Luca? Hard to keep track. Who is this? Someone who's very interested in what you're planning to tell the FBI tomorrow. A pause. And someone who'd prefer you didn't tell them anything at all. Sarah's blood went cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Jennifer Walsh called the FBI 40 minutes ago, offered your cooperation, said you'd be at their field office at 8 a.m. with information about Lucien's organization. The voice was calm, almost friendly. That's a problem for certain people who'd prefer the De Luca empire stay intact. Then those people should take it up with Lucy. Lucien's in federal custody. You're not, which makes you the problem we need to solve. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a choice. Don't show up tomorrow. Disappear. There's an account in your name in Grand Cayman with $2 million. Clean money. Yours if you walk away. Or you can testify against Lucien and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder wondering when we're going to find you. Who is we? People who've invested considerably in Lucien's operations. People who don't appreciate witnesses. People who make problems disappear when those problems threaten their interests. The voice hardened. You seem smart, Sarah. Smart enough to know that testifying against Lucien makes you a target for the rest of your life. Smart enough to take $2 million and disappear somewhere warm. Smart enough to stay alive. The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen in Lucien's office, her reflection in the dark windows looking like a ghost. Her hands were shaking again. Her chest felt tight. The casual cruelty in that voice, the certainty that she could be threatened and bought and scared into silence, made something in her chest crack open. Not fear, rage. She was so tired of being threatened, so tired of being used, so tired of men who thought they could control her with promises or violence or $2 million in an offshore account. Marcus reappeared with copies of the surveillance folder, stopped when he saw Sarah's expression. What happened? He asked. Someone just called, threatened me, offered me money to not testify tomorrow. Marcus's expression went cold. Did you recognize the voice? No. But he knew about Jennifer calling the FBI. He knew I was supposed to be at their field office at 8. Sarah looked at Marcus. How many people knew that? Just us. Jennifer. The FBI. Marcus pulled out his phone. Which means someone in one of those groups is feeding information to Lucien's associates. We need to tell Jennifer. Now. He made the call while Sarah tried to steady her breathing, tried to push down the panic that was clawing up her throat. Tried to remember that tomorrow she was walking into the FBI field office, whether shadowy voices threatened her or not, because she was done running, done being scared, done letting other people write her story. When Marcus hung up, his expression was grim. Jennifer's calling the FBI now. They'll provide protection. Someone will be here within the hour to make sure you're safe until tomorrow morning. And after tomorrow? After tomorrow, you're in witness protection protocols if you need them. New identity, new city, new life. Marcus studied her. But I don't think that's what you want. What I want, Sarah said quietly, is to look Lucien in the eye and ask him if any of it was real. If he felt anything beyond cold calculation when he kissed me. If there was ever a single moment where I was more than just a mark. And if he says no, then I'll know for certain that I'm making the right choice. Sarah walked to the windows overlooking the Atlantic. The same view she'd stood at 3 weeks ago, believing she was becoming powerful, believing someone finally saw her, believing love and revenge could somehow coexist. All of it lies. All of it manipulation. All of it designed to destroy her one more time. But this time, Sarah wasn't going to let them win. This time, she was going to fight back with everything she had. This time, she was going to become the nightmare everyone should have seen coming. I want to see him, Sarah said suddenly. Before tomorrow. Before I testify. I want to see Lucien. Marcus shook his head. That's a bad idea. The FBI won't allow it. Your lawyer won't allow it. It compromises everything. I don't care. I need to know if any of it was real. I need to hear him say it to my face. Sarah turned from the window. Can you make it happen? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Lucien's being held at a federal facility in South Boston. He'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. After that, he'll be transferred to a detention center until trial. If you're going to see him, it has to be tonight. Then make it happen. Sarah, make it happen, Marcus, please. Something in her voice must have convinced him. He pulled out his phone again and made a series of calls Sarah couldn't quite follow. Favors being called in, strings being pulled, money changing hands in ways that suggested Marcus had his own connections beyond Lucien's organization. When he finally hung up, he looked resigned. You have 30 minutes, Marcus said. Midnight, one visitor, no recording devices. And if anyone finds out I arranged this, we're both fucked. Thank you. Don't thank me. This is probably the worst decision either of us has ever made. But Marcus was already moving toward the door. Get changed, something less conspicuous than that dress. We leave in 20 minutes. Sarah went upstairs to her suite, stripped off the midnight blue silk and diamonds, dressed in jeans and a sweater that belonged to a version of herself she barely recognized anymore, pulled her hair into a ponytail, scrubbed off the makeup that had made her look like she belonged in ballrooms. When she looked in the mirror, she saw the waitress from Dorchester again. Tired, angry, desperate, but not broken. Not anymore. Marcus drove her into Boston in a car that wasn't the Rolls-Royce, something dark and anonymous that wouldn't attract attention. They didn't speak. Sarah watched the city pass outside her window and tried to prepare herself for seeing Lucien again. For looking at the man who'd promised her power and protection and turned out to be the biggest threat of all. The federal facility was a concrete building that looked exactly like what it was, a place where dangerous people were held before trial. Marcus parked in a lot across the street. They waited until midnight exactly. Then Marcus led her inside through a side entrance where a guard was conveniently looking the other way. Favors had definitely been called in. Money had definitely changed hands. They went downstairs, through hallways that smelled like disinfectant and despair, past holding cells where Sarah caught glimpses of other people waiting for arraignment, for lawyers, for lives to restart or end depending on what happened next. A guard led her to a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. Told her she had 15 minutes, left before Sarah could change her mind. She waited alone in fluorescent light and silence. Then the door opened and Lucien walked in. He wore an orange jumpsuit instead of tailored suits. His hands were cuffed in front of him. His dark hair was disheveled. He looked exhausted in a way she'd never seen him, but his eyes when they met hers were the same, intelligent, assessing, missing nothing. The guard attached his cuffs to a ring on the table, left them alone. Lucien and Sarah stared at each other across metal furniture in a room designed for confessions. You shouldn't have come, Lucien said finally. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been shouting or hadn't spoken in hours. "I needed to see you," Sarah said. "I needed to ask you something. I know what you're going to ask, and I don't have an answer that will make you feel better. Try anyway." Sarah leaned forward. "Was any of it real? The marriage? The promises? The way you looked at me like I actually mattered? Was there ever a single moment where I was more than just part of your escape plan?" Lucian's jaw tightened. "Sarah, don't lie to me. Not now. Not after everything." Her voice cracked. "I found the folder, the surveillance photos. 7 months of watching me, profiling me, waiting for the perfect moment to approach. I know what I was. I know I was a mark. But I need to know if you felt anything real. Anything at all." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. "Yes," Lucian said finally. "It started as strategy. You were perfect, isolated, vulnerable, exactly what I needed to move money and create legal complications when the FBI closed in. But somewhere between the wedding and the fundraiser, something shifted. You weren't supposed to be remarkable. You weren't supposed to be someone I actually—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter now." "Say it," Sarah demanded. "You owe me that much." "I cared about you." The words came out raw, honest in a way nothing else between them had been. "I married you for strategy and stayed married because I wanted to. Because watching you become powerful was the most interesting thing that's happened to me in 15 years. Because you were supposed to be a puppet, and you turned into someone who could actually stand beside me. And yes, I used you, but I also wanted to protect you. Both things were true." Sarah's eyes burned. She refused to cry, refused to give him that. "Then why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why didn't you warn me the FBI was coming? Why did you let me walk into that fundraiser believing we were destroying the Carlyles when you knew everything was about to collapse? Because telling you would have made you complicit, would have implicated you beyond what I could protect you from. This way, with you as the victim, you have a chance. You testify against me. You walk away. You build whatever life you want with the money I made sure would be clean." Lucien's hands flexed against the cuffs. "I set you up to survive, even if it meant you'd hate me for it." "I don't hate you," Sarah said, and realized it was true. "I hate what you did. I hate that you used me. But I don't hate you. Because you were right about one thing. You did remind me how powerful I could be. You taught me that survival requires sharp edges and cold calculations. You showed me exactly what I needed to become to never be a victim again." She stood. Lucien's expression shifted. "What are you going to do?" "Tomorrow I'm going to testify against you. I'm going to tell the FBI everything, and then I'm going to take everything you built and I'm going to burn it down until nothing's left but ashes. The Carlyles. Your organization. Everyone who thought they could use me and get away with it." Sarah leaned across the table, close enough to see gold flecks in his dark eyes. "You wanted to see what I'd become with resources and power. You're about to find out." For the first time since she'd met him, Lucien looked genuinely surprised. Then something that might have been pride flickered across his face. "You're going to be magnificent," he said softly. "I know." Sarah walked to the door, knocked. The guard appeared immediately. "Wait," Lucien called. Sarah turned back one last time. "Sarah, I'm sorry. For what it's worth. I'm sorry I wasn't better. Sorry I couldn't be what you needed. Sorry I destroyed you trying to save myself." "You didn't destroy me," Sarah said. "You just gave me permission to stop pretending to be someone I'm not." She left before he could respond, walked back through fluorescent hallways with Marcus waiting at the end, his expression carefully neutral. "Get what you needed?" he asked. "Yes." They drove back to the estate in silence. Sarah stared out the window at Boston's skyline and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. Not closure, not healing, clarity. She'd spent a month believing other people held the power to save her or destroy her. Nathaniel, Lucian, the Carlyles, the FBI. All of them had controlled her narrative, written her story, decided what she was worth. Not anymore. Tomorrow she was walking into the FBI field office, but not as a victim, not as someone cooperating because she had no choice, as someone who'd decided exactly how this story ended. And it was going to end with everyone who'd underestimated her, realizing they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Back at the estate, FBI agents had arrived. two of them waiting in the foyer with the kind of professional alertness that suggested they'd been briefed on the threats against Sarah. They'd stay until morning, make sure she made it to the field office alive. Sarah went upstairs to her suite, stripped off her clothes, stood under a shower hot enough to burn until her skin was red and her chest ached from crying she refused to let become sobs. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a robe that belonged to a life she was leaving behind, her phone showed 17 missed calls. Unknown numbers, blocked numbers. People trying to scare her into silence. Sarah deleted them all without listening. Then she typed out a text to Jennifer Walsh. Tomorrow, I'm not just testifying against Lucien, I'm testifying against everyone. The Carlyles, Thorne, anyone connected to this. I want full immunity, and I want protection to go after all of them. Jennifer's response came immediately. That's not how witness protection works. You testify against Lucien, that's the deal. Sarah typed back, then make a new deal. Because I'm not stopping until every single person who used me pays for it. And if the FBI won't help me do it legally, I'll find another way. Her phone rang seconds later. Jennifer, Sarah answered. Are you insane? Jennifer demanded. You can't threaten to go after everyone. You can't. Watch me, Sarah interrupted. I spent a month learning how power works in this city. I know where bodies are buried. I know who owes whom. I know secrets that would destroy half the people at that fundraiser. And tomorrow I'm walking into your field office with a choice. Help me take them all down, or I'll do it myself and deal with the consequences. Sarah, listen to me. No, you listen to me. I'm done being the victim everyone wants me to be. I'm done cooperating quietly. I'm done letting other people write my story. Sarah's voice was ice. Tomorrow I become the nightmare Boston should have seen coming. You can either help me or get out of my way. She hung up before Jennifer could argue, dropped the phone on her bed and walked to the windows overlooking the Atlantic. The ocean raged against the cliffs below, indifferent to human drama. But Sarah wasn't indifferent anymore. She was angry, focused, ready to burn everything down and rebuild from the ashes. Lucien had wanted to see what she'd become with power. The Carlyles had wanted her to disappear quietly. The FBI wanted a cooperative witness who'd testify and vanish. They were all about to learn the same lesson. Sarah Whitmore was done being what other people needed her to be. Tomorrow, she was becoming exactly who she wanted to be. And God help anyone who stood in her way. Sarah didn't sleep. She spent the hours before dawn sitting at the window watching darkness give way to gray November light, her mind racing through everything she was about to do. Every name she'd memorized, every detail Elena had taught her about shell corporations and money flows. Every conversation she'd overheard during those 3 weeks when she'd been too focused on revenge to realize she was being prepared as evidence. The FBI agents changed shifts at 6. New faces, same professional alertness. They made coffee in Lucien's kitchen and pretended not to watch her every move. Marcus appeared at 7 with clothes Jennifer had sent over, tailored pants, a cashmere sweater, coat that looked expensive but not ostentatious. Nothing that screamed wealth. Nothing that would make her look like Lucien's wife instead of his victim. Sarah dressed mechanically, pulled her hair into a low ponytail. No makeup beyond what made her look tired and human. She needed to walk into that field office looking like someone who'd been destroyed, not someone plotting revenge. Jennifer arrived at 7:30 in her own car, expression all business. We need to talk before we go, she said, pulling Sarah into Lucien's office. Away from the FBI agents, away from Marcus. Just the two of them, and the weight of what Sarah was about to do. I spoke with the assistant U.S. attorney overnight, Jennifer said. After your emphatic phone call. They're willing to expand the scope of your testimony beyond just Lucien, but there are conditions. What conditions? You testify about what you know, not what you suspect, not rumors or theories, hard facts you can prove. If you implicate people without evidence, it compromises the entire case and you lose immunity. Jennifer's expression was severe. That means you can't just walk in there and throw around names hoping something sticks. You need concrete information that leads to concrete charges. Sarah pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app where she'd spent the past 3 weeks documenting everything Elena had taught her. Names, dates, transaction details, the architecture of an empire she'd been studying like it was a graduate degree. I have evidence, Sarah said. Elena didn't just teach me theory, she showed me actual documents, bank records, emails, contracts. I memorized everything because I thought I was supposed to be part of this world. I didn't know I was supposed to be the witness who brought it down. Jennifer's eyes widened as she scrolled through Sarah's notes, page after page of detailed information about money laundering schemes, shell corporations, political bribes disguised as campaign donations. Not just Lucian's organization, the Carlyles, Gregory Thorne. A dozen other names Sarah had memorized without understanding their significance. This is... Jennifer looked up, her professional mask slipping into something like awe. This is enough to indict half of Boston's political elite. I know. Sarah's voice was flat. That's why I'm not just testifying against Lucian. I'm testifying against everyone who thought they could build empires on the backs of people like me and never face consequences. Sarah, you understand what you're doing? These aren't just criminals. These are people with resources, power, the kind of connections that make witnesses disappear. Good. Let them try. Sarah met Jennifer's eyes. I'm done being afraid. I'm done shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. If they come for me, I'll make sure taking me down costs them everything. Jennifer studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, let's go burn it all down. The FBI field office was a concrete building in Chelsea that looked designed to crush hope. They entered through security that felt more invasive than airports, phones confiscated, metal detectors, guards who looked at Sarah like she was already guilty. Jennifer guided her through hallways painted institutional beige to a conference room on the third floor. Inside, 3 people waited around a table covered in file folders and recording equipment. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen, early 40s, sharp suit, eyes that had seen every kind of criminal and developed immunity to bullshit. 2 FBI agents Sarah didn't recognize, all of them studying her with professional skepticism. Mrs. DeLuca, Chen said, not standing, thank you for coming in voluntarily. It's Ms. Whitmore, Sarah corrected. I'm not using his name anymore. Chen's expression flickered with something that might have been approval. Ms. Whitmore, then. Please, sit. Sarah sat. Jennifer beside her. Across the table, 3 people who would decide whether she walked out of here free or in handcuffs. Chen activated the recording equipment, stated date, time, names present, then looked at Sarah with the kind of focus that suggested she'd already formed opinions about who Sarah was and what she was worth. Let's start with how you met Lucian DeLuca, Chen said. Sarah told them everything. The cathedral, the humiliation, Lucian appearing with a handkerchief and an impossible offer, the drive to the hotel, the business card, her decision to call him the next day because she was so desperate for revenge she couldn't see she was walking into a different kind of trap. She told them about the contracts, the money that appeared in her account, $5 million she'd thought was protection, but was actually the first layer of a scheme that would eventually implicate her in $40 million of laundered funds. She told them about Elena, the lessons, learning the architecture of Lucien's empire without understanding she was being prepared as evidence, Marcus teaching her how to move through dangerous spaces, Margot making her beautiful enough to be taken seriously. She told them about the wedding, the 3 weeks of preparation, the growing certainty that she was becoming powerful when she was actually just becoming complicit. And then she told them about the fundraiser, about walking into the Fairmont on Lucien's arm, about seeing Nathaniel's face, about the moment the FBI had surrounded them and Elena had revealed the truth, that Sarah had never been his wife, just his scapegoat. Chen listened without interrupting. The FBI agents took notes. Jennifer sat beside Sarah with protective intensity, ready to shut down any question that crossed lines they'd established. When Sarah finished, Chen leaned back in her chair. That's a compelling story, she said, and it makes you very sympathetic, but sympathy doesn't build cases, evidence does. What can you actually give us beyond your personal experience? Sarah pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app, slid it across the table. Everything Elena taught me about Lucian's organization, shell corporations, offshore accounts, money laundering pipelines through real estate acquisitions. Every detail I memorized because I thought I was supposed to be part of this world. Chen scrolled through the notes. Her expression remained neutral, but Sarah saw her eyes sharpen, saw the FBI agents lean forward, saw the moment they realized Sarah wasn't just a traumatized victim. She was a witness who'd been given access to an entire criminal empire and had been paying attention. These names, Chen said, Gregory Thorne, Senator Richard Carlisle, Patricia Carlisle, You're alleging they were all involved in Lucian's operations? Not alleging, stating, Thorne facilitated connections between Lucian and politicians who needed money off the books. Senator Carlisle borrowed $12 million for his Senate campaign with no intention of paying it back because Lucian assured him the loan would be forgiven if certain political favors were granted. Patricia Carlisle knew about the arrangement and actively participated in covering it up. Can you prove any of this? Elena showed me bank records, emails, contracts. I don't have copies. I wasn't supposed to be gathering evidence, but I know where they're kept. Lucien's estate, his office, encrypted drives in a safe behind a painting of his mother. I can tell you exactly where to look. The room went silent. Chen and the FBI agents exchanged glances that spoke volumes. You're saying you can give us locations for physical evidence that would implicate not just Lucian, but multiple co-conspirators, including a sitting senator? Yes. And you're willing to testify to all of this in court? Yes. Even though it will make you a target for everyone you're implicating? Sarah leaned forward, especially because of that. I want them to know it was me. I want Senator Carlisle to watch his campaign collapse because the woman his son humiliated became the witness who destroyed him. I want Nathaniel to understand that discarding me was the worst decision his family ever made. I want everyone who thought I was forgettable to realize they created their own nightmare. Chen almost smiled. Almost. All right, Ms. Whitmore, let's talk immunity. You cooperate fully. You testify when called. You provide detailed information about everything you learned. In exchange, we grant you immunity from prosecution for any crimes you may have unknowingly participated in through your association with Lucien DeLuca. And protection? Witness protection if needed. Though given your attitude, I suspect you won't want to disappear quietly. I don't. Sarah's voice was steel. I want to stay visible. I want them to see me rebuild my life while theirs collapse. I want to be the constant reminder that underestimating people has consequences. Noted. Chen pulled out documents. Sign these. They formalize your cooperation agreement. Then we'll send a team to the estate to secure the evidence you've identified. Sarah signed. Her hand didn't shake. Jennifer witnessed. The FBI agents processed paperwork with efficient speed. When it was done, Chen stood, extended her hand. Welcome to the winning side, Ms. Whitmore, she said. Let's destroy some empires. The next 6 weeks were a blur of depositions and evidence processing and watching dominoes fall. The FBI raided Lucien's estate and found exactly what Sarah said they would. Encrypted drives, documents, a paper trail that connected dozens of people to criminal enterprises they'd thought were safely hidden. Marcus cooperated immediately, providing additional testimony in exchange for reduced charges. Other members of Lucien's organization followed suit once they realized the empire was collapsing and loyalty meant nothing against federal prison sentences. Senator Carlisle's campaign imploded within a week. The Boston Globe ran a front-page story about illegal campaign financing and loans from organized crime. Major donors fled. Political allies distanced themselves. By the time federal charges were filed, Richard Carlisle had already withdrawn from the Senate race and was negotiating a plea deal that would still land him in prison for 5 years minimum. Patricia Carlisle faced her own charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice. She hired the best lawyers money could buy, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah had memorized every detail of conversations Elena had shared about the Carlisle family's involvement. Every transaction, every meeting, every moment they'd thought they were untouchable. Gregory Thorne turned government witness immediately, throwing everyone else under the bus to save himself. His testimony corroborated everything Sarah had said and added layers she hadn't known about. By the time prosecutors finished building their cases, they had enough to indict 47 people across Boston's political and business elite. And through it all, Nathaniel Carlisle watched his world burn. He wasn't charged with anything criminal. He'd been naive rather than complicit, apparently. But his reputation was destroyed by association. The golden heir to a political dynasty became the cautionary tale about families built on corruption. He couldn't get hired, couldn't show his face at events without cameras swarming, couldn't escape the narrative that he'd humiliated the wrong woman, and she'd become the catalyst for his family's complete destruction. Sarah watched it all unfold from a townhouse in Back Bay that the FBI had secured for her safety. Not witness protection, not hiding, just strategic distance while trials proceeded and threats were neutralized. She enrolled in law school at Boston University, used the $5 million from her prenuptial agreement, the only money that was legitimately hers, to pay tuition and living expenses. Studied the same legal frameworks that had been used against her. Learned how power actually worked in the systems she'd been victimized by. Lucien's trial was scheduled for March. Sarah would be the prosecution's star witness. She'd sit on the stand and tell the same story she'd told Chen 6 weeks ago. But this time, Lucien would be sitting across the courtroom listening to his wife, his mark, his scapegoat, his catastrophic miscalculation, destroy him with the same precision he'd used to profile her. She almost looked forward to it. In February, Sarah received a letter. It came through her lawyer because she wasn't allowed direct contact with Lucien while he was awaiting trial. But somehow he'd found a way to reach her anyway. The envelope was simple. No return address, just her name and handwriting she recognized. Sarah opened it alone in her townhouse, standing at windows overlooking Back Bay with coffee going cold in her hand. The letter was short. Sarah, I know you won't forgive me. I'm not asking you to. But I need you to understand something before you testify. Everything I told you in that holding cell was true. You were supposed to be strategy, and you became someone I actually cared about. Someone I wanted to protect, even when protecting you meant setting you up to destroy me. I've spent 15 years building an empire on violence and manipulation, but the 3 weeks with you were the first time I'd felt anything real since my mother died. You reminded me what it was like to care about someone beyond their usefulness. And yes, I used you. But I also loved you in the broken way men like me love. Desperately, destructively, too late to matter. You asked if any of it was real. The answer is yes. All of it. The marriage, the promises, the moments when I watched you become powerful and felt something close to pride. It was all real, even though it was also all manipulation. Both things existed simultaneously. That's what makes it tragic instead of just criminal. Testify. Destroy me. Send me to prison for the rest of my life. You'll be doing the world a favor. But know that somewhere in the wreckage of what I built, there was genuine feeling buried under layers of calculation. For what it's worth, and I know it's worth very little, I'm sorry. Not for getting caught. For never being the man you deserved. Lucien Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she burned it in her kitchen sink and washed the ashes down the drain. Because even if it was true, even if Lucien had actually felt something real, it didn't change what he'd done. It didn't erase 7 months of surveillance. It didn't undo the manipulation. It didn't make using her as a scapegoat somehow romantic instead of criminal. Love wasn't an excuse. It was just another weapon men like Lucien used when all their other weapons failed. The trial began on a Monday in March. Sarah wore a navy suit that made her look professional and serious. Hair pulled back. Minimal makeup. She wanted the jury to see someone credible, not someone performing victimhood. The courtroom was packed with media and spectators hungry for the scandal that had consumed Boston's elite for months. Sarah walked to the witness stand with her spine straight and her hand steady, aware of every eye on her but no longer afraid of being seen. She was sworn in, stated her name, sat down in the witness box, and finally looked at Lucy. He sat at the defense table in a suit his lawyers had provided, looking nothing like the dangerous man who'd offered her revenge outside a cathedral. He looked tired, older, resigned to whatever came next. But when their eyes met, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, regret, maybe even the pride he'd mentioned in his letter. Sarah looked away first. The prosecutor, Rebecca Chen herself, approached the stand. "Ms. Whitmore," she began, "can you tell the jury how you met the defendant?" Sarah told them everything. Every detail from the cathedral to the fundraiser. Every lesson Elena had taught her. Every moment she'd believed she was becoming powerful when she was actually just being prepared as evidence. She spoke for 3 hours, interrupted only by objections from Lucien's lawyers that were mostly overruled. She described finding the surveillance photos, learning she'd been profiled for 7 months, realizing the man who'd promised to protect her had actually been setting her up to take the fall for crimes she didn't commit. And through it all, Lucien watched her with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Not anger, not betrayal, just acceptance of consequences he'd apparently known were coming since the moment he'd offered her that handkerchief. When Sarah finished, Chen smiled. No further questions, Your Honor. Lucian's lawyer stood for cross-examination. He was expensive, the kind of defense attorney who'd made a career out of creating reasonable doubt. But Sarah had been preparing for this moment for months. She'd studied trial transcripts, practiced with Jennifer, learned how to answer questions without giving defense attorneys openings to twist her words. The cross-examination lasted 2 hours. The lawyer tried to paint Sarah as a willing participant, as someone who'd known exactly what she was doing. As a woman who'd married Lucien for money and was now trying to play victim when it served her interests. Sarah shut down every attempt with facts. She provided dates, details, evidence that contradicted the narrative he was trying to build. She stayed calm, never raised her voice, never showed the anger that burned in her chest. By the time the lawyer sat down, he looked frustrated. Sarah had given him nothing to work with. She was excused from the stand, walked back to her seat in the gallery with her head high and her hands steady. Didn't look at Lucien as she passed his table. Didn't need to. She'd said everything that needed to be said. The trial continued for 2 more weeks. Other witnesses testified. FBI agents presented evidence. Marcus described the internal workings of Lucien's organization with clinical precision. Elena, who'd taken her own plea deal, explained how she'd prepared Sarah as evidence while making her believe she was being prepared for power. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, wire fraud, every charge the prosecution had brought. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Lucien was remanded into custody immediately. Sarah watched marshals lead him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and for the first time since the cathedral, she felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just the quiet certainty that she'd survived something designed to destroy her and come out stronger. Sentencing day arrived with spring rain hammering Boston. Sarah attended because she wanted to be there when Lucien heard his fate. Wanted him to see her one last time before he disappeared into the federal prison system for what would probably be the rest of his life. The courtroom was less crowded this time. The media had moved on to newer scandals. Only a handful of people remained invested in watching Lucien DeLuca's final chapter. Sarah sat in the front row. Lucien was brought in wearing the same orange jumpsuit from the night she'd visited him in holding. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded slightly. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or goodbye. The judge read the charges and verdicts with professional detachment, then delivered the sentence. 35 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. Lucien took it without flinching. He'd known this was coming, had been preparing for it since the moment the FBI had arrested him at the fundraiser. Does the defendant wish to make a statement? The judge asked. Lucien's lawyer shook his head, but Lucien stood anyway. I do, Your Honor, he said. The judge looked surprised, but gestured for him to proceed. Lucien turned slightly, not toward the judge, toward Sarah. I want to apologize, he said. His voice carried through the courtroom with the same certainty it always had. Not to the court, not to the people I defrauded or the lives I destroyed. To Sarah Whitmore. Sarah's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this. You deserved better, Lucien continued. You deserved someone who saw your potential and helped you reach it without using you. Someone who protected you without making you a weapon. Someone who loved you without destroying you in the process. He paused. I wasn't that person. I never could have been. But I hope you become everything I saw in you that first day outside the cathedral. Everything you were always meant to be. And I hope you do it without ever looking back at the wreckage I left behind. He sat down before Sarah could respond, before she could process what he'd just said in front of a courtroom full of people. The judge banged her gavel. Sentencing concluded. Marshals led Lucien away. Sarah sat frozen in her seat as the courtroom emptied around her. Jennifer appeared at her elbow, asking if she was all right. Sarah nodded without really answering. She walked out of this courthouse into spring rain that felt like cleansing, like the universe washing away everything that had happened in the past 6 months and giving her permission to start over. Her phone buzzed. Message from Rebecca Chen. Carlisle sentencing tomorrow. Thought you might want to attend. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, I'll be there. Senator Richard Carlisle's sentencing was quieter than Lucien. Fewer cameras, less spectacle, Just a disgraced politician facing consequences for crimes he'd thought political connections would protect him from. Sarah sat in the same front row seat she'd occupied for Lucian's sentencing, watched Richard Carlyle stand before the judge, looking smaller than he'd seemed at the fundraiser. His wife Patricia beside him, she'd already been sentenced to 3 years for her role in the conspiracy. Nathaniel sat in the gallery, his golden air shine tarnished to dull brass by association. The judge sentenced Richard Carlyle to 7 years in federal prison. He took it with the practiced dignity of someone who'd spent a lifetime pretending failures were strategic choices, showed no emotion, no remorse, just cold acceptance that his political career was over and his legacy would be defined by corruption instead of public service. When it was finished, Sarah stood to leave. She'd seen enough, had closure on every person who'd tried to use her and failed, but as she walked toward the exit, Nathaniel intercepted her in the hallway. "Sarah," he said. "Wait, please." She stopped, turned, looked at him with the same cold assessment he'd used on her in the cathedral 6 months ago. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" He faltered. The confidence that had carried him through life had evaporated somewhere between his father's arrest and watching his family empire collapse. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for what I did, for how I treated you, for not seeing—" "Not seeing what?" Sarah interrupted. "Not seeing that I was a person who deserved basic respect? Not seeing that using me for political optics and then humiliating me on camera might have consequences? Not seeing that I'd become someone powerful enough to destroy your entire family?" Nathaniel flinched. "All of it. I'm sorry for all of it." "I don't care." Sarah's voice was flat, empty of emotion. "Your apology means nothing. It doesn't undo what you did. It doesn't erase the humiliation. It doesn't change the fact that you looked at me and saw someone disposable, someone beneath you, someone forgettable. I know, I needed you to know that I realize I was wrong, that you weren't beneath me, that I made the biggest mistake of my life When you what? When you used me? When you discarded me? Or when you underestimated what I'd become when I stopped trying to earn love from people who'd never give it?" Sarah stepped closer. "You didn't make a mistake, Nathaniel. You made a choice. And that choice revealed exactly who you are. Someone who values status over humanity. Someone who thinks apologies repair damage that goes soul deep. Someone who's still trying to make himself feel better by seeking forgiveness he'll never get." She turned to leave. Nathaniel grabbed her arm. "Please," he said. "I loved you. I did. I was weak. I let my family control me. I let their expectations matter more than what I actually wanted. But I did love you." Sarah looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face, at the desperation there, at the boy who'd thought charm could compensate for cowardice. "No, you didn't," she said quietly. "You loved the idea of me. The hardworking fiancée who made you look relatable. The woman who was grateful enough to never question you. You loved what I could do for your image. But you never loved me. Because if you had, you wouldn't have been capable of what you did in that cathedral." She pulled her arm free. Nathaniel didn't try to stop her again. "I forgive you," Sarah said. Not because she meant it, because she wanted him to understand something. "Not for your sake. For mine. Because carrying anger for someone as insignificant as you became is exhausting. So I forgive you, and I release you. And I promise you this. I will forget you ever existed long before you forget seeing me walk into that fundraiser as someone you couldn't touch anymore." She left him standing in the courthouse hallway, looking like his world had ended. Which it had. Just not in the way he'd feared. Spring turned to summer. Sarah finished her first year of law school at the top of her class. Spent summers interning with organizations that helped women escape abusive relationships. Learned how to use the legal system to protect people instead of victimizing them. Built a life that had nothing to do with revenge or men who'd tried to destroy her. The townhouse in Back Bay became home. She decorated it carefully, art she actually liked instead of what was expensive. Books she wanted to read. Furniture that felt comfortable instead of impressive. She adopted a cat from a shelter. Named her Justice because Sarah had developed a sense of humor about her own transformation. She made friends in law school. Real friends who knew her story but didn't define her by it. People who saw her as Sarah, just Sarah, instead of the woman who'd brought down Boston's elite. Sometimes she went to coffee shops in Dorchester, walked past the diner where she used to work double shifts, reminded herself where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled. Not in miles, in becoming. She dated occasionally, carefully. Men who had to earn her trust instead of expecting it. She was done believing love required sacrificing herself. Done thinking protection meant surrendering power. Done confusing intensity with intimacy. In August, Sarah received an email from a publisher. They'd followed her story in the news. They wanted her to write a book. Her perspective on surviving manipulation and finding power in the aftermath of destruction. They offered an advance that made Sarah's eyes water. She signed the contract the same day. Spent the next year writing her story. Not as a victim memoir, as a survival guide. Practical advice for women who found themselves in situations where every choice felt impossible. How to recognize manipulation, how to document abuse, how to build evidence, how to find lawyers, how to testify, how to rebuild, how to become powerful instead of just surviving. The book published in June to reviews that called it essential and devastating and required reading. It sold faster than the publisher expected. Sarah did interviews, spoke at conferences, became the kind of person other women reached out to when they needed someone who understood. She never went back to the estate overlooking the Atlantic. The FBI had seized it as evidence. Eventually, it was sold to pay restitution to Lucian's victims. Sarah heard it went to a tech entrepreneur from California who had no idea about its history. She was glad someone would fill it with new memories that weren't soaked in manipulation and lies. Marcus reached out once after his own reduced sentence was complete, asked if she needed security. Sarah declined but thanked him for teaching her how to read rooms and recognize danger. Those lessons had saved her life more than once. She never heard from Elena again, didn't want to. Lucian wrote her twice from federal prison. Sarah returned both letters unopened. She had nothing left to say to him. His apology in court had been enough. Anything more was just him trying to ease his own guilt instead of letting her move forward. On the anniversary of the cathedral, Sarah stood at the window of her townhouse overlooking Back Bay and thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Desperate, humiliated, believing her value came from whether someone else chose to love her. That woman felt like a stranger now. Sarah had learned the hardest way possible that no one could give her power. She had to claim it herself. Build it from the wreckage of every person who'd tried to destroy her. Forge it in the fire of survival. She'd learned that love without respect was just another kind of violence. That promises meant nothing without actions to back them up. That the most dangerous people were the ones who saw her clearly and decided to use her anyway. She'd learned that revenge was a dish best served through legal testimony and federal indictments. That justice was real even when it was slow. That sometimes the best way to destroy someone was to live well invisible while they rotted in prison. She'd learned that she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever given her credit for. That surviving didn't make her broken. That carrying scars didn't mean she couldn't heal. That becoming hard didn't mean losing her humanity. Most importantly, she'd learned that she didn't need saving. She just needed to stop waiting for permission to save herself. Sarah picked up her phone, scrolled through contacts until she found the one she was looking for. Hit call. Sarah? Her foster sister's voice from Ohio. Surprised, pleased. They'd reconnected 6 months ago after years of Sarah being too ashamed to stay in touch. Everything okay? Everything's good, Sarah said, and meant it. I was just thinking, when's the last time you visited Boston? Never. You know I can't afford... I'm paying. Flights, hotel, everything. I want you to come visit, see what I've built, meet my friends. Just be here. Her sister was quiet for a moment, then, You sure? I'm sure. Your family. And I'm done pretending I don't need people just because some people hurt me. They made plans. Her sister would visit in September. Sarah would show her the townhouse, the law school. The life she'd built from absolutely nothing, with only her own determination and the $5 million that had been meant to make her complicit, but had instead given her freedom. When she hung up, Sarah felt lighter. She walked to her desk where her laptop sat, surrounded by notes for her second book. This one about power dynamics in criminal organizations drawn from everything she'd learned and survived. She had a meeting with her publisher next week, an interview with NPR the week after, a speaking engagement at a women's legal conference in October. Her calendar was full of a future she'd built herself. No one had given it to her. No one could take it away. Sarah opened her laptop and started writing. The words came easily now. She'd spent a year learning how to tell her story without drowning in it, how to transform trauma into testimony, how to make meaning from chaos. Outside, Boston hummed with late summer energy. The city that had destroyed her twice had eventually given her the tools to rebuild. Not because it was kind, because she'd refused to stay broken. Her phone buzzed with a text from one of her law school friends. "Drinks tonight? We're celebrating Name's job offer." Sarah typed back, "I'll be there. What time?" She got ready slowly. Dressed in clothes she'd chosen for herself. Did her makeup the way she liked it. Looked in the mirror and saw someone strong. Someone who'd survived. Someone who'd taken the worst things that could happen and transformed them into power. Sarah DeLuca didn't exist anymore. She'd never really existed. She'd just been a legal fiction. A name on documents that were meant to destroy Sarah Whitmore, but had instead given her the evidence to destroy everyone else. Sarah Whitmore, though, she was real. She was the waitress from Dorchester who'd worked 3 jobs and believed hard work mattered. She was the woman who'd been humiliated in a cathedral and refused to stay humiliated. She was the mark who'd been profiled and manipulated and used as a scapegoat, and had become the witness who brought down an empire. She was the survivor who'd testified for hours and walked out of that courtroom with her head high. She was the law student who'd topped her class, the author whose book was helping other women escape, the speaker who told her story without shame, the friend who showed up, the sister who reconnected, the woman who'd learned that power wasn't given, it was claimed. She was Sarah Whitmore, and she was finally, completely, unapologetically free. Sarah grabbed her coat and keys, walked out of her townhouse into a Boston evening that smelled like possibility. Behind her, the life she'd rebuilt from nothing. Ahead, a future she'd write herself. No one would ever use her again. No one would ever make her feel small again. No one would ever underestimate her again. And if they tried, well, she'd learned from the best how to destroy people who thought they were untouchable. Sarah smiled as she walked toward the tea station. Not the cold smile she'd worn at the fundraiser, not the broken smile from the cathedral, just the real, genuine smile of someone who'd survived hell and come out laughing. The greatest revenge, she'd learned, wasn't destroying the people who'd hurt her. It was becoming someone so powerful they could never hurt her again. And as Sarah Whitmore disappeared into the Boston crowd, just another woman heading out for drinks with friends, living her life, claiming her space, she carried with her the knowledge that she'd done exactly that. She'd survived. She'd fought back. She'd won. And most importantly, she'd become someone she was proud to be. Not because someone else had seen her potential, but because she'd finally given herself permission to be extraordinary.